The first person to laugh was Clara's younger sister. It was not a cruel laugh at first. It sounded almost accidental, a startled little burst of amusement that escaped into the heavy silence of the Whitmore drawing room before anyone could pretend not to have heard it. Then the others joined in, quietly, politely, the sort of laughter reserved for tragedies that belonged to someone else. Clara Whitmore sat perfectly still at the end of the long walnut table, while the family solicitor adjusted his spectacles and stared down at the final page of her late father's will as though he regretted every word written there. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Whitmore Hall. Outside, November winds bent the bare branches of the estate's ancient elms toward the darkening sky. Inside, candlelight flickered across polished silver trays, untouched teacups, and faces sharpened by anticipation. The inheritance had already been divided. Everyone in the room had received something valuable. Everyone except Clara. Her older brother, Edmund Whitmore, had inherited the estate itself, including the London townhouse in Mayfair, the hunting grounds in Sussex, and nearly 4,000 acres of profitable farmland. Her younger sister, Lydia, had received a dowry large enough to attract half the titled bachelors in England before spring. Her stepmother, Lady Beatrice Whitmore, had been granted a lifetime allowance and possession of the family's summer residence in Bath. Even distant cousins had walked away with jewelry, paintings, horses, and investment shares. Clara had received a key. A single iron key no longer than the width of her hand now rested alone atop the velvet lining of a small wooden box before her. Nothing else. No money. No property. No letter of explanation. Just a key. "Surely there is more," Lydia said at last, struggling to suppress another smile behind her lace handkerchief. "Father cannot possibly have left Clara only that dreadful little thing." Mr. Holloway, the solicitor, cleared his throat. The late Lord Whitmore's instructions were very precise. Edmund leaned back in his chair with visible relief. At 30 years old, he possessed the broad shoulders and handsome features that had once made their father admired throughout Parliament circles. Unfortunately, he had also inherited Lord Whitmore's arrogance and twice his appetite for gambling. "Well," he said lightly, swirling amber brandy in his crystal glass, "at least Clara now possesses something uniquely her own." Another ripple of restrained amusement moved around the room. Clara lowered her eyes to the key resting inside the box. Iron. Old-fashioned. Heavy despite its size. There was a faint engraving along the handle, worn nearly smooth by time. She had never seen it before in her life. Strange. Her father had hidden many things over the years. Documents, letters, entire emotions, but never from her. At least she had once believed that. "Perhaps," Lady Beatrice said sweetly, "your father intended it as a sentimental gesture, something symbolic." Clara finally looked up. Her stepmother's pale blue eyes glittered with satisfaction beneath carefully arranged mourning veils. Beatrice Whitmore had always excelled at appearing gracious while delivering wounds with surgical precision. "A symbol of what?" Clara asked calmly. Lady Beatrice smiled. "Of acceptance, perhaps." Lydia nearly choked, trying not to laugh again. Clara felt the humiliation settle over the room like smoke. Not loud. Not dramatic. Worse. Controlled. Civilized. The kind of mockery that aristocratic society preferred because it left no visible bruise. Across from her, Aunt Margaret sighed with theatrical sympathy. "Poor Clara," she murmured. "What unfortunate luck for a woman already so close to becoming a spinster." "Aunt Margaret," Lydia whispered, "you must not say such things." "Must I not?" The older woman shrugged. "We are family. Better honesty here than whispers in London later." Clara folded her gloved hands carefully in her lap. She would not cry. Not here. Not before them. Her father had died only 6 days earlier after a sudden illness that had swept through Whitmore Hall with terrifying speed. Even now, the scent of medicinal herbs lingered faintly beneath the beeswax candles and polished wood. She still expected to hear his footsteps in the corridor outside. Still expected him to open the door and complain about the rain staining his boots. But death had a dreadful talent for silence. "There is one additional note," Mr. Holloway said suddenly. The room quieted again. Clara lifted her gaze. The solicitor looked deeply uncomfortable now. Lord Whitmore requested that Miss Clara Whitmore retain possession of the key until— he hesitated. Until the arrival of His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshire. The atmosphere changed instantly. Even the rain beyond the windows seemed quieter. Edmund frowned. The Duke of Ravenshire? Lydia blinked rapidly. Why would father involve the Duke? Lady Beatrice's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Clara noticed because she had spent 12 years learning how to read every small shift in her stepmother's face. Fear. That was fear. Interesting. Mr. Holloway adjusted his papers again. His Grace was expected this afternoon. Expected? Edmund scoffed. Adrian Ashbourne does not attend funerals or family readings. The man barely attends Parliament. Nevertheless, the solicitor replied carefully, Lord Whitmore personally amended the will 3 months ago to include him. Clara felt a strange unease settle into her chest. Duke Adrian Ashbourne. Even hearing his name altered the room. The Duke of Ravenshire possessed one of the oldest titles in England and a reputation severe enough to silence crowded ballrooms upon arrival. He was wealthy beyond reason, politically feared, and notoriously impossible to impress. Clara had seen him only twice in her life from a distance. Once at the opera in London. Once at a winter charity gala where women half her age had nearly fainted trying to secure his attention. He had spoken to none of them. This is absurd, Edmund muttered. Father had not spoken to Ravenshire in years. Mr. Holloway said nothing. Clara looked again at the iron key. Her father had never mentioned the Duke. Not once. Yet somehow the two were connected now through whatever secret lay hidden behind this strange inheritance. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows. Then, from somewhere deep within the manor, came the unmistakable sound of the front doors opening. Heavy footsteps crossed the marble entrance hall downstairs. Calm, unhurried, authoritative. One of the maids hurried past the drawing-room doorway, pale-faced and breathless. His Grace has arrived, she whispered. Silence swallowed the room whole. Lydia straightened immediately. Edmund set down his glass. Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened around the armrest of her chair so hard the knuckles beneath her gloves turned white. Clara remained still, though her pulse had begun to beat far too quickly beneath the high lace collar of her morning dress. A moment later, the butler appeared in the doorway. His Grace, he announced carefully. The Duke of Ravenshire. Adrian Ashbourne entered the room like winter itself. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black wool and charcoal silk that fit him with ruthless precision. Candlelight caught briefly against silver cufflinks before sliding across the sharp lines of his face. He was not merely handsome. Handsome implied softness. The Duke of Ravenshire looked carved from restraint and power. His dark hair was brushed neatly back from a forehead marked by faint concentration lines. His gray eyes swept across the room once, cool and unreadable, before settling on the wooden box before Clara. Not on Edmund. Not on Lady Beatrice. On the key. Then finally, slowly, on her. Clara felt the strange sensation of being examined rather than merely seen. Not as men usually looked at women in drawing rooms. Not evaluating beauty. Not judging charm. Measuring. Calculating. As though he were searching for something beneath the surface. The Duke inclined his head politely. "My condolences," he said. His voice was low and controlled. The kind of voice that did not need volume to command attention. "Your Grace," Edmund answered quickly, stepping forward. "This is an unexpected honor." Adrian's gaze barely shifted toward him. "Is it?" The question landed softly. Edmund immediately fell silent. Clara almost pitied him. Almost. The Duke removed a pair of dark leather gloves slowly, placing them beside the nearest chair before turning toward Mr. Holloway. "Has the will been fully read?" "Nearly, Your Grace." "Then continue." No one argued with him. The solicitor swallowed hard and looked down at the remaining page. "There is one final instruction from Lord Whitmore concerning Miss Clara Whitmore and the item left in her possession." Clara felt every eye in the room swing toward her again. The Duke remained motionless beside the fireplace. The instruction reads as follows. Mr. Holloway continued carefully. The key belongs to my daughter Clara. No person may remove it from her possession under any circumstance until Ravenshire himself explains what is truly hers. The room went completely still. Clara's breath caught. Lady Beatrice's face lost color. Edmund stared openly now. Lydia whispered, "What does that mean?" But no one answered her. Because the Duke of Ravenshire had not taken his eyes off Clara Whitmore once since entering the room. No one spoke for several seconds after the solicitor finished reading the final instruction. The rain continued its relentless assault against the tall windows of Whitmore Hall, while candlelight trembled softly across stunned faces. Clara could almost hear the room thinking. Not mourning. Not grieving. Calculating. Why would one of the most powerful dukes in England involve himself in her father's will? Why would a man like Adrian Ashbourne care about Clara Whitmore, the overlooked daughter who had apparently inherited nothing? The Duke remained near the fireplace, one gloved hand resting lightly against the carved mantel as though the silence itself belonged to him. His expression revealed nothing. Not curiosity, not sympathy, certainly not surprise. That unsettled Clara more than anything else. He had expected this. "Your Grace," Edmund said at last, forcing a strained smile back onto his face. "Surely there has been some misunderstanding." Adrian shifted his gaze toward him slowly. "Has there?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Edmund laughed weakly. Father was not entirely himself near the end. Illness clouds judgment. Your father's judgment remained considerably sharper than most men I encounter in Parliament, Adrian replied evenly. Lydia lowered her eyes at once. Even Aunt Margaret suddenly became fascinated by her untouched teacup. Clara noticed something else. Lady Beatrice had not spoken once since the Duke entered the room. That alone was remarkable. Her stepmother never surrendered control of a conversation willingly. Yet now she sat rigidly upright in her chair, fingers intertwined tightly in her lap beneath layers of black morning silk. Fear lingered around her like perfume. The Duke turned back toward Mr. Holloway. "Read the instruction again." The solicitor obeyed immediately. "No person may remove it from her possession under any circumstance until Ravenshire himself explains what is truly hers." Adrian nodded once. "Thank you." Clara finally found her voice. "Your Grace." His eyes lifted to hers immediately, gray, cold, intelligent enough to make her suddenly aware of every thought she had not spoken aloud. "You knew my father?" she asked carefully. "For many years. Then perhaps you understand this better than I do." "I understand enough." The answer was maddeningly incomplete. Clara tightened her fingers around the small wooden box resting in her lap. "And what exactly is this supposed to mean?" For the first time since entering the room, something almost human crossed the Duke's expression. Not warmth. Something quieter. Regret, perhaps. "That," he said softly, "depends on how much your father managed to hide before he died." Edmund straightened sharply. "Hide what?" Adrian ignored him entirely. Clara noticed it again. The Duke did not merely dismiss people. He erased them. "Miss Whitmore," he said, still watching her with unsettling steadiness. "May I ask whether anyone attempted to take the key from you before my arrival?" Clara blinked. "No. No one searched your rooms?" "Of course not," Edmund snapped. "What exactly are you implying?" Adrian finally looked toward him again. "I rarely imply anything, Mr. Whitmore." The warning beneath the calm reply settled heavily over the room. Clara's pulse quickened slightly. Her father had always spoken carefully around powerful men. But Adrian Ashbourne spoke like a man entirely unaccustomed to being questioned. Mr. Holloway cleared his throat nervously. "There is also the matter of the secondary document, Your Grace." Lady Beatrice's head turned too quickly. Adrian noticed. Clara saw it in the slight narrowing of his eyes. "Bring it here," the Duke said. The solicitor reached into his leather case and withdrew a sealed envelope tied with dark blue ribbon. Clara immediately recognized her father's handwriting across the front. For Clara, to be opened only in the presence of Ravenshire. Her breath caught softly. She had not seen her father write in weeks before his death. The illness had weakened him too quickly. Why was this withheld? Adrian asked quietly. Mr. Holloway looked miserable. Lord Whitmore insisted the letter remain sealed unless your grace personally attended. The Duke held out his hand. The solicitor obeyed at once. Clara watched Adrian break the seal carefully. Not casually, respectfully. He unfolded the letter in silence while the room waited. Clara studied his face as he read. At first there was nothing. Then something changed. Very slightly. A hardening around the mouth. Pause midway down the page. By the end, the Duke's expression had become almost dangerously still. Well? Edmund demanded. What does it say? Adrian folded the letter once. It says your father anticipated complications. Lady Beatrice finally spoke. Complications regarding what? Her voice remained smooth, though Clara noticed the tension beneath it immediately. Adrian looked directly at her. Regarding his daughter. The silence that followed felt sharp enough to cut skin. Clara's heartbeat thudded unevenly against her ribs. Her father had hidden something. Not sentimental nonsense. Not grief-stricken confusion. Something serious enough to involve one of the most feared men in England. This is absurd, Edmund said again, though he sounded less certain now. Clara inherited a key. Nothing more. Did she? Adrian asked softly. No one answered him. The Duke stepped closer at last, moving with controlled ease across the Persian carpet until he stood beside Clara's chair. She became suddenly aware of how tall he truly was. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder when she rose at balls. Up close, his presence felt almost overwhelming. Not because he demanded attention, because he expected it. His gaze dropped briefly toward the key in her lap. May I? Clara hesitated only a second before lifting the wooden box toward him. Their fingers brushed lightly as he took it. Warmth moved unexpectedly through her hand. Ridiculous. She withdrew immediately. Adrian studied the key in silence. Candlelight glinted faintly against the worn iron surface. Then, very carefully, he turned it over. Clara saw it the same instant he did. A nearly invisible engraving hidden along the underside of the handle. An ash tree. Interesting, the Duke murmured. What? Clara asked. He glanced toward her. Your father was more cautious than I realized. You are speaking in riddles. For the moment, that is unavoidable. Edmund exhaled sharply. If there is something to say, then say it plainly. Adrian closed the box. Very well. The room froze again. Your father believed certain matters concerning the Whitmore estate were not what they appeared to be. Lady Beatrice went pale beneath her mourning powder. Clara noticed instantly. So did the Duke. What matters? Clara asked quietly. Adrian's eyes returned to hers. Financial records, property transfers, documents that may have been altered over several years. Edmund stared at him. That is an outrageous accusation. Is it? Adrian replied calmly. You are suggesting fraud? Aunt Margaret whispered. I am suggesting, the Duke said evenly, that your father died before completing an investigation he began nearly a year ago. Clara felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her father had spent many late evenings locked inside his study over the past year. She remembered trays of untouched dinners returning cold to the kitchen. Letters burned in fireplaces before dawn. Increasing arguments with Edmund behind closed doors. Dear God. No, Edmund said sharply. Father never mentioned any investigation. I imagine there are many things your father stopped mentioning to you. The insult landed with surgical precision. Edmund flushed immediately. Clara almost expected him to protest again. Instead, he looked away. Interesting. Very interesting. Adrian handed the wooden box back to Clara personally. Keep this with you at all times. Why? Because, he said quietly, I suspect several people in this house already understand its value better than you do. Clara felt every pair of eyes in the room shift uneasily. The Duke stepped back slightly. "Miss Whitmore, I would like to speak with you privately." Lady Beatrice answered before Clara could. "Surely that would be inappropriate." Adrian turned toward her with frightening calm. "Then it is fortunate I was not requesting your permission." Lydia looked as though she might faint from the tension alone. Clara slowly rose from her chair, still holding the small wooden box tightly against her black morning dress. The Duke extended his arm toward the doorway with cool formality. "After you." She hesitated only briefly before walking beside him toward the corridor outside. Behind them, Whitmore Hall remained wrapped in silence. But Clara could feel it now beneath the polished manners and mourning clothes. Fear. Real fear. And somehow, for reasons she did not yet understand, the key in her hands had become the center of it all. The corridor beyond the drawing room felt colder than the rest of Whitmore Hall. Wind pressed softly against the tall stained-glass windows lining the western passage while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the estate grounds. Clara walked beside the Duke in silence, acutely aware of the steady rhythm of his footsteps against polished marble floors. Servants immediately lowered their eyes as he passed. One footman nearly dropped an entire silver tray after realizing who stood before him. Adrian Ashbourne noticed none of it. Or perhaps he noticed everything and simply considered it irrelevant. Clara tightened her hold on the wooden box resting against her ribs. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "Your father's study. It has been locked since his death." "I know." The answer unsettled her. They turned down the final corridor toward the eastern wing of the manor where Lord Whitmore had spent most of his final months isolated behind closed doors and endless stacks of correspondence. Clara remembered evenings spent waiting outside the study door, while her father muttered instructions to servants through the crack without ever inviting anyone inside. At the time she had assumed grief or illness had changed him. Now she was no longer certain. The Duke stopped before the carved oak doors. Candle sconces flickered softly against dark green wallpaper faded by decades of winter smoke. "Did your father ever speak to you about the estate accounts?" he asked suddenly. Clara frowned slightly. "Not in detail. Did he trust your brother with finances?" She hesitated. Father trusted Edmund because Edmund was his heir. Adrian's expression did not change. "That was not my question." Clara looked away briefly. "No," she admitted quietly. "He did not." The Duke nodded once as though confirming something already suspected. "Open the door." Clara blinked. "It is locked." Adrian glanced meaningfully toward the wooden box in her hands. Understanding hit her instantly. Her pulse stumbled. Slowly, she lifted the small iron key from its velvet lining. Up close beneath the corridor candlelight, the engraving along the handle appeared clearer than before. The ash tree symbol twisted elegantly around the worn metal like roots. Her fingers trembled slightly as she inserted the key into the study lock. A soft metallic click echoed through the hallway. Clara stared at the handle in disbelief. "This key belongs to the study?" "Partially," Adrian replied. "Partially." But before he answered, she pushed the door open. The scent hit her first. Leather, dust, ink, her father's tobacco. The room remained exactly as he had left it. Tall bookcases stretched from floor to ceiling beneath dark walnut beams. A fire long extinguished rested cold inside the marble hearth. Papers covered nearly every surface. Open ledgers, rolled maps, half-finished letters. It looked less like a gentleman's study and more like the workspace of a man racing against time. Clara stepped inside slowly. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in her throat. For one foolish second, she imagined her father still seated behind the enormous mahogany desk near the windows overlooking the south gardens. She could almost hear the scratch of his fountain pen. Adrian closed the door quietly behind them. "Your father spent the last 11 months investigating missing revenue tied to the Whitmore estate." Clara turned sharply toward him. "Missing revenue? Money, land contracts, trade shares." He walked toward the desk with measured calm. At first he believed the discrepancies were clerical mistakes. Then he realized someone had been altering records. Clara stared at him. Why would he not tell me? Because he believed you were safest uninvolved. Something painful moved through her chest at those words. Safest. Not protected. Hidden. Adrian picked up one of the ledgers from the desk and opened it. Your father contacted me last spring. Why you? Because I oversee several parliamentary trade commissions connected to shipping and land taxation. He needed someone outside the family. Clara moved closer despite herself. The Duke stood beside the desk beneath warm candlelight filtering across the severe lines of his face. Without the crowded drawing room around him, he seemed somehow more dangerous in solitude. More real. And what did you discover? She asked softly. Adrian turned several pages before stopping. Someone has been diverting estate profits for years. Clara's breath caught. That is impossible. Unfortunately, it is not. He angled the ledger toward her. Rows of figures stretched across yellowed paper in neat columns of ink. Clara recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Certain numbers had been circled repeatedly with furious pressure. Others were crossed out entirely. These shipping returns should be nearly double, Adrian explained. The Whitmore shipping routes through Liverpool remain extremely profitable. Yet according to these records, the estate has operated at losses for nearly 3 consecutive years. Clara frowned. Edmund said the trade markets declined. They did. Adrian's eyes lifted toward hers. Not enough to explain this. Silence settled between them. Rain tapped steadily against the windows now, softer than before. Clara looked again at the ledgers scattered across the study. Her father had not been grieving behind locked doors these past months. He had been searching for something. You think my brother stole from the estate. I think your father feared someone close to him manipulated financial records. That is not the same accusation. For the first time, something almost resembling approval flickered across Adrian's expression. No, he admitted quietly. It is not. Clara folded her arms tightly against the sudden chill spreading through her. And where do I fit into this? Adrian watched her carefully for several seconds before answering. Your father trusted you. That does not explain the key. No, he reached into the inner pocket of his dark coat and withdrew a folded document. This does. Clara accepted it cautiously. The paper bore her father's unmistakable seal pressed in dark blue wax. Her throat tightened as she unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky in places but still familiar. Clara, if you are reading this, then Ravenshire has kept his word. There are truths hidden within this house that I could not safely reveal while alive. Trust no one too quickly, especially those who benefit most from your silence. Clara stopped breathing for a moment. Adrian said nothing while she continued reading. The accounts are not the only matter concealed. There is something inside this estate that belongs to you alone. The key will lead you to it when the time is right. Ravenshire understands where to begin. Tears blurred her vision unexpectedly. Not dramatic tears. Quiet ones. The kind born from hearing a dead parent's voice one final time through ink and paper. He knew he was dying, she whispered. Adrian's voice softened slightly. Yes. Clara lowered the letter carefully. What did he mean by something belonging to me? That, Adrian replied, is what we are going to discover. Before she could respond, he crossed toward the massive bookcase lining the far wall of the study. Come here. Clara followed slowly. The Duke studied the shelves with practiced attention before stopping near a row of leather-bound law journals. Your father mentioned hidden architectural modifications made to the estate shortly after your grandfather's death. Hidden modifications? Adrian pressed one hand lightly against the carved wood beside the shelves. Whitmore Hall was renovated 30 years ago. Several interior walls were altered. Clara stared at him. You believe there is a hidden room? I believe your father rarely did anything without purpose. The Duke's fingers moved along the wood carefully before pausing beside a nearly invisible brass indentation. Then he glanced toward her. The key, Miss Whitmore. Clara stepped closer, suddenly aware of how near they stood in the dim candlelit study. The scent of cedar and cold winter air lingered faintly around him. Ridiculous that she noticed such things now. She handed him the key. Their fingers brushed again. This time neither withdrew immediately. Adrian inserted the iron key into the concealed lock hidden within the bookshelf panel. A heavy metallic sound echoed softly through the study. Then, slowly, part of the bookcase shifted inward. Clara stared in disbelief as a narrow hidden doorway emerged from the wall itself. Darkness waited beyond it. Dust drifted through the opening air untouched for years. Her heartbeat quickened violently. "My God!" she whispered. Adrian removed the key and placed it back into her hand with deliberate care. "Whatever your father hid," he said quietly, "he intended only you to find." The hidden room was smaller than Clara expected. Narrow shelves lined the stone walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with ledgers, sealed document boxes, rolled maps, and stacks of correspondence tied carefully with fading ribbons. Dust coated nearly every surface. The air smelled dry and ancient, untouched by sunlight or conversation for years. Clara stepped cautiously across the threshold while Adrian lit a second candle from the study hearth and carried it inside. Warm light spread slowly through the darkness, revealing a narrow writing desk positioned beneath a tiny concealed window no larger than a dinner plate. "Dear God," Clara whispered again, "how long has this been here?" "Long enough for your father to trust it more than the rest of this house," Adrian replied quietly. She moved toward the shelves in disbelief. Entire boxes were labeled in her father's handwriting. Liverpool accounts, estate transfers, Ravenshire correspondence, parliamentary contracts. Some documents appeared decades old. Others looked recent enough that the ink remained sharp and dark. He hid all this behind a wall? Men expecting betrayal often become creative. Clara glanced toward him. "You speak from experience." Adrian did not answer immediately. His gray eyes remained fixed on the room itself, studying every corner with careful precision. "Experience teaches caution," he said at last. Before Clara could press further, footsteps echoed faintly somewhere beyond the study door outside. Both of them went still instantly. The Duke extinguished unnecessary movement from his expression so completely that Clara nearly forgot he had spoken at all moments earlier. Another sound followed. The creak of floorboards in the corridor. Someone lingering outside the study. Adrian stepped toward the hidden doorway immediately and lowered his voice. "Not a word about this room." Clara nodded once. Her pulse had begun racing again. The footsteps paused outside. Then came a knock. Sharp, controlled. "Clara?" Edmund's voice carried faintly through the study door. "Are you still in there?" Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Clara stepped back through the concealed entrance while the Duke closed the hidden panel with swift precision. The bookshelf settled seamlessly into place seconds before Edmund opened the study door without waiting for permission. He stopped short upon seeing them standing together near the desk. "There you are." His smile looked strained. Mother was concerned. Clara folded the letter from her father carefully into her sleeve. "How touching." Edmund ignored the remark and focused on Adrian instead. "Your Grace, surely this family matter has occupied enough of your time already." The Duke regarded him calmly. "Has it?" Edmund exhaled slowly through his nose. "Father's death has caused enough confusion without introducing rumors." "Rumors generally require uncertainty," Adrian replied. "I prefer facts." Clara saw her brother's composure flicker for just an instant. Then it returned. "Of course." Edmund straightened his cuffs. "The household will remain in mourning for the next several weeks. Afterward, Lydia's engagement celebrations must continue. Society does not pause forever." Clara stared at him. "Father has been dead less than a week. And creditors do not care about grief." His voice sharpened slightly. "Whitmore Hall requires stability now." Adrian's eyes narrowed almost invisibly. Interesting choice of words. Edmund looked toward him carefully. "Meaning?" "Nothing," the Duke said, which somehow sounded more threatening than an accusation. Silence stretched between the three of them until Edmund finally forced another polite smile. "Dinner will be served shortly." He turned toward Clara. You should make an effort to appear composed. People are already talking. The words landed harder than he intended. Clara knew that immediately because he looked faintly regretful afterward, but not regretful enough to apologize. Talking about what? She asked quietly. Edmund hesitated. Adrian answered for him. About your inheritance. Clara felt humiliation rise hot beneath her skin despite herself. Of course they were already talking. Aristocratic society fed on humiliation the way fireplaces fed on coal in winter. A woman inheriting nothing from her own father was precisely the kind of elegant tragedy London adored discussing over tea and opera programs. Edmund avoided her eyes now. You know how people are. Yes, Clara said softly. I do. Dinner that evening unfolded beneath a suffocating atmosphere of polished tension. The long dining table glittered beneath crystal chandeliers while servants moved soundlessly between silver platters and untouched wine glasses. Outside, rain continued falling steadily over Whitmore Hall. Inside, conversation struggled to survive. Clara sat halfway down the table wearing deep black morning silk that suddenly felt heavier than before. Across from her, Lydia attempted several nervous observations about London fashions and upcoming winter musicales only for each comment to collapse beneath the Duke's presence. Adrian Ashbourne occupied the seat at the head of the guest side of the table with the same effortless authority he carried everywhere else. He spoke rarely, yet every servant watched him carefully. Every relative measured their words around him. Even Lady Beatrice maintained unusual restraint. Clara noticed another thing as the evening progressed. Adrian watched people. Not obviously, quietly, calculatingly. He seemed to observe the room the way a chess player studied a board several moves ahead. Every glance, every hesitation, every reaction. Lady Clara, Cousin Frederick said suddenly from farther down the table. I confess the inheritance situation surprised all of us. Clara set down her fork carefully. Did it? Well, he laughed awkwardly. One naturally expects a daughter to receive something more substantial than a key. Lydia smiled into her wine glass. Clara felt the sting anyway. Adrian did not look up from his untouched brandy. A surprising number of fortunes begin with keys, he said calmly. Frederick blinked. I beg your pardon? Vaults, estates, private archives, parliamentary records. Adrian finally lifted his eyes. Doors generally require keys for a reason. The cousin immediately fell silent. Clara lowered her gaze to hide the faintest flicker of gratitude threatening to betray itself across her expression. Ridiculous. The Duke was not defending her. He was controlling the room. Still, warmth stirred unexpectedly beneath the humiliation anyway. After dinner, the ladies withdrew toward the drawing room while thunder rolled low across the distant countryside. Clara lingered briefly near one of the ballroom windows overlooking the rain-soaked gardens. Candlelight reflected softly against the glass beside her pale reflection. You are handling this remarkably well. Adrian's voice came from behind her. Clara turned slowly. Most guests had moved farther into the drawing room now, leaving them briefly alone near the windows. Handling what? Being publicly pitted by half the county. Her laugh escaped softly before she could stop it. You possess a very direct form of comfort, Your Grace. I was not attempting comfort. No, I noticed. Something faint shifted at the corner of his mouth. Almost amusement. Dangerous how much that altered his face. Clara looked away quickly. I have attended enough seasons in London to understand how society works, she said quietly. People enjoy watching women lose value publicly. Adrian studied her carefully. And do you believe you have lost value? The question caught her off guard. Clara stared out toward the rain again. Somewhere beyond the dark gardens stood the family cemetery where her father had been buried only days earlier beneath cold November skies. Objectively speaking? She asked softly. Yes. Explain. I am 25 years old, unmarried, nearly penniless according to public understanding. My brother now controls this estate. My sister possesses a fortune large enough to attract titled proposals. Society values security, beauty, and usefulness. She smiled faintly without humor. At present, I appear to possess none of the three. Silence settled briefly between them. Then Adrian spoke with startling calm. Society is often stupid. Clara blinked before an entirely unexpected laugh escaped her. Real this time, quiet but genuine. The Duke watched her with unreadable eyes. There, he said softly. That expression suits you considerably better than resignation. Warmth touched her cheeks instantly. Dangerous again. Very dangerous. Before she could answer, the butler entered the drawing room carrying a silver tray stacked with fresh correspondence. "Post from London, my lady," he announced toward Lady Beatrice. Several letters changed hands across the room while conversation resumed in careful fragments. Then Lydia suddenly gave a delighted gasp. "Oh!" She looked up from one cream-colored envelope with shining excitement. "Lady Ashcombe's winter ball has been moved forward to next Thursday." Aunt Margaret brightened immediately. "Already? How wonderful!" Clara looked away toward the rain again. Of course the season would continue. Society always continued. Death paused nothing for long among the aristocracy. Lydia turned eagerly toward Adrian. "Your Grace, surely you will attend?" The room quieted slightly. Everyone wanted the same answer. The Duke of Ravenshire appeared publicly perhaps 6 times each season if London was fortunate. Adrian accepted the glass of brandy a servant handed him before replying. "Possibly." Lydia smiled brightly. "Then Clara must attend as well." Clara turned sharply. "I beg your pardon? You cannot remain hidden here forever," Lydia insisted. "People will think you are devastated." Clara nearly laughed at the absurdity. "I am devastated. Yes, but not visibly devastated." Lady Beatrice sighed delicately. "Your sister means well." Adrian's gaze shifted toward Clara. "Will you attend?" The question felt oddly different coming from him. Not pressure. Genuine curiosity. Clara hesitated. Every instinct warned against entering a ballroom now while whispers about her inheritance spread through London drawing rooms like wildfire. She could already imagine the sympathetic glances, the quiet mockery, the pity disguised as kindness. Adrian seemed to read every thought crossing her face. "People speak regardless," he said quietly. "You may as well force them to do it while looking directly at you." Clara stared at him. Such an extraordinarily ruthless form of encouragement. Yet beneath the coldness lingered something else. Respect. He was not offering pity. Somehow that mattered more than it should have. Slowly, Clara lifted her chin. "Very well," she said softly. "I will attend the ball." Across the room, Lady Beatrice's expression tightened almost invisibly. Adrian noticed immediately. So did Clara. And for the first time since her father's death, she began to suspect the whispers surrounding her inheritance were not the thing her stepmother feared most. Clara did not sleep that night. Long after the household retired and Whitmore Hall fell silent beneath the storm, she remained awake in her bedchamber staring at the small iron key resting atop her dressing table beside a dying candle flame. Wind rattled softly against the windows overlooking the eastern gardens. Somewhere downstairs, grandfather clocks marked each passing hour with solemn precision. Yet sleep refused to come. Her father had hidden an entire room behind the study wall. He had trusted Adrian Ashbourne with secrets he had never shared with his own family. And worst of all, part of Clara already suspected the Duke knew far more than he intended to reveal. By dawn, exhaustion settled beneath her eyes like bruised shadows. Still, she dressed carefully for breakfast in dark charcoal silk appropriate for morning and pinned her chestnut hair into a neat arrangement despite trembling fingers. Weakness invited attention. Attention invited questions. And questions had become dangerous inside Whitmore Hall. The morning passed beneath strained civility. Edmund left early for meetings with estate managers. Lydia spent nearly an hour complaining about London dressmakers over chocolate and toast while Lady Beatrice watched Clara with unsettling attentiveness across the breakfast table. The Duke remained absent entirely. His Grace departed before sunrise. One servant informed them quietly while refilling teacups. Clara tried not to feel strangely disappointed by the news. Ridiculous reaction. Adrian Ashbourne owed her nothing. Yet the manor seemed colder without his presence moving through it. More vulnerable somehow. By early afternoon the rain finally eased into gray mist drifting across the estate grounds. Clara stood alone inside the library attempting unsuccessfully to focus on a book when hurried footsteps approached from the corridor outside. A maid appeared moments later, slightly breathless. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes." "His Grace has returned." Clara's pulse betrayed her instantly. She closed the book too quickly. "I see. He requested you meet him in your father's study." Of course he did. 20 minutes later Clara entered the eastern corridor once again. The study door stood partially open this time, warm candlelight spilling across the marble floor outside. She paused briefly before stepping inside. Adrian stood near the windows overlooking the gardens, dark coat removed, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms as he examined several ledgers spread across the desk. Strange how dramatically such a small detail altered him. Less untouchable aristocrat. More dangerous man. He looked up immediately when she entered. "You did not sleep." Clara frowned slightly. "Is it that obvious?" "To me." The quiet certainty in his voice unsettled her more than the observation itself. Adrian gestured toward the desk. "Come here." Clara moved closer cautiously. Several new documents now covered the mahogany surface alongside maps of trade routes and estate boundaries she did not recognize. "What happened?" she asked. "I visited the Whitmore accounting offices in town this morning. Without informing Edmund." "Correct." Clara almost smiled despite herself. "And?" Adrian slid one ledger toward her. "Your father was right." She lowered her eyes toward the pages. "About what exactly?" "Money has been disappearing from the estate for years." Clara stared at the figures. Numbers circled in dark ink. Entire transactions crossed out. Several shipments marked received in one ledger appeared completely absent from another. "How much money?" she asked quietly. Adrian's jaw hardened slightly. "Enough to threaten the estate within another 2 years." Shock moved coldly through her chest. "That is impossible. Whitmore Hall has survived for generations. And nearly all great houses believe themselves indestructible before collapse." Clara sank slowly into the leather chair beside the desk. "Father knew." "Near the end, yes." Adrian moved toward the hidden bookshelf again. "He suspected someone manipulated trade records through the Liverpool shipping offices. Edmund oversees those accounts." "I know." Clara closed her eyes briefly. Part of her still resisted believing her brother capable of deliberate betrayal. Careless spending. Gambling. Vanity. Yes. But theft from his own family? The idea felt unbearable. Adrian studied her quietly. "You do not want it to be true, would you?" His expression remained unreadable. Truth rarely asks permission before arriving. Silence settled briefly between them before he reached toward the concealed brass mechanism hidden beside the shelves. The secret doorway opened once again with a soft grinding sound. Dust drifted through the narrow beam of afternoon light filtering from the hidden room beyond. "There is more," he said. Clara rose immediately despite the knot tightening in her stomach. The hidden archive felt different during daylight. Less ghostly than before. More intimate. Like entering the private thoughts of a man no longer alive to explain them. Adrian carried 2 candles toward the narrow writing desk while Clara approached one of the lower shelves stacked with sealed document boxes. Several labels caught her attention immediately. Whitmore estate transfers. Ravenshire correspondence. Clara's inheritance. Her breath caught. "Your Grace." Adrian turned instantly. She pointed toward the final box. For the first time since she had met him, genuine surprise crossed his face. Brief. Gone almost immediately, but real. Slowly he approached beside her. Dust coated the dark blue box heavily enough that no one had touched it in years. Clara lifted trembling fingers toward the lid. "Open it," Adrian said quietly. Inside lay dozens of letters bundled carefully with pale ribbon alongside rolled legal documents secured by wax seals. Clara recognized her father's handwriting immediately. Some envelopes bore her name. Others carried the Ravenshire crest. One item rested separately atop the others. A leather-bound journal. Adrian picked it up slowly. "May I?" Clara nodded. He opened the journal carefully while she moved closer beside him. The pages contained detailed entries written over nearly 12 months. Dates, account figures, names, meetings, suspicions. Clara felt sick almost instantly. Her father had documented everything. Missing trade shares, altered contracts, payments redirected into private accounts hidden beneath false company names. Several entries mentioned Edmund directly. Others referenced pressure from Lady Beatrice to liquidate portions of estate property quietly before spring. "Dear God," Clara whispered. Adrian turned another page. His expression darkened further. "There." Clara followed his gaze. One paragraph had been underlined repeatedly. "If anything happens to me before the investigation concludes, Clara must never trust the inheritance arrangements at face value. The estate itself is not the true target. Something else remains hidden." Clara's throat tightened painfully. "What does that mean?" "I do not know yet." Adrian closed the journal carefully. "But your father believed someone wanted more than money." Clara sank slowly into the narrow chair beside the hidden desk. The room suddenly felt too small for breathing, too crowded with secrets. "He was alone," she whispered. "All this time he was trying to fix everything alone." Adrian's voice softened unexpectedly. "No. He contacted me before matters became desperate." Clara looked up at him. "Why did you agree to help?" Silence lingered longer than usual before he answered. "Your father once saved my family from ruin." Clara blinked. "What?" Adrian leaned one hand against the hidden desk beside her. 20 years ago, my father made disastrous investments after my mother's death. Ravenshire nearly lost half its shipping interests. Your father intervened privately before Parliament discovered the situation." Clara stared at him. "Father never mentioned that." "He would not have." Something quieter entered Adrian's voice now, more personal. "He considered loyalty a debt that should not be publicly displayed." Clara lowered her gaze. That sounded painfully like her father. Loving in silence. Protecting in silence. Dying in silence. Adrian studied her face carefully. "You resemble him." The words startled her enough that she looked up immediately. "Not physically," he clarified. "In temperament." Warmth touched her cheeks before she could stop it. Ridiculous again. She stood abruptly and crossed toward another shelf to steady herself. "There must be more documents." Adrian allowed the change in subject without comment. Together they spent the next hour sorting through ledgers, correspondence, and estate maps while fading afternoon light stretched long shadows across the hidden room. Several discoveries emerged quickly. Trade contracts had indeed been manipulated. Entire shipments vanished from official records. Money moved repeatedly through shell companies connected to London banking firms. Yet none of it explained why Clara herself remained central to her father's warnings. Then Adrian unfolded one final document near sunset and went completely still. Clara looked up immediately. "What is it?" He did not answer at once. His eyes scanned the page again with frightening focus before finally lifting toward hers. "Your father transferred something into your name 6 months ago." Clara frowned. "What?" Adrian held the document carefully between his fingers. "Not land. Not money." His expression hardened. "Voting shares." "In what?" Silence. Then slowly Adrian spoke. "The Ravenshire Atlantic Trade Consortium." Clara stared at him blankly. Even she knew the consortium controlled one of the largest shipping networks in England and America combined. Parliament ministers invested in it. Dukes built fortunes through it. "That is impossible," she whispered. Adrian's gaze remained fixed on the document. "No," he said quietly. "It is very possible." Clara's pulse quickened violently. "Why would father place something like that in my name?" Adrian folded the document slowly. "Because whoever controls those shares controls far more than Whitmore Hall." The hidden room suddenly felt colder than winter itself. And for the first time, Clara began to understand the true scale of whatever her father had died trying to protect. For the next 3 days, Clara discovered precisely how quickly humiliation traveled through aristocratic society when accompanied by money, or in her case, the apparent absence of it. By the time Whitmore Hall received its first wave of London callers after the funeral, the story had already transformed into something almost theatrical. According to rumor, Clara Whitmore had inherited nothing because her father no longer trusted her judgment. According to another version, Lord Whitmore had disowned her quietly before his death after discovering secret debts. One particularly inventive account claimed she had refused a wealthy marriage proposal years earlier and lost her inheritance as punishment for excessive pride. None of it was true. Of course, that hardly mattered. Society preferred elegant fiction to uncomfortable truth. Clara sat beside the drawing-room window on Thursday afternoon, pretending to read while Lady Beatrice entertained visitors from neighboring estates. Beyond the glass, pale winter sunlight stretched weakly across frost-covered gardens. Inside, conversation drifted around her like smoke. "Such a tragedy," Lady Pembroke murmured loudly enough to ensure Clara heard every word. "A daughter receiving so little." "Lord Whitmore was always practical with finances," another woman replied. "Perhaps he simply believed Miss Whitmore unlikely to marry now." Clara turned a page without seeing it. "One cannot blame men for prioritizing heirs," Lady Pembroke continued delicately, "especially when daughters remain unmarried beyond a certain age." Clara nearly smiled at that. 25. As though she had crossed into ancient ruin rather than survived several disappointing London seasons. Across the room, Lydia accepted sympathy with visible satisfaction disguised poorly as concern. "Clara has always been terribly independent," she said softly. "Father worried she lacked proper practicality." Lady Beatrice sighed gracefully into her teacup. "My husband adored Clara, naturally, but affection and financial trust are not always identical matters." Clara finally lifted her eyes from the untouched book in her lap. "How fortunate," she said calmly, "that none of us must suffer identical personalities." Silence dropped over the room instantly. Lady Pembroke nearly choked on her tea. Lydia stared openly. Lady Beatrice's smile froze. Clara returned her attention to the page before her. Her pulse beat faster beneath the composed exterior, though satisfaction warmed her despite herself. Perhaps humiliation became easier to survive once one stopped apologizing for existing inside it. "Miss Whitmore." A footman appeared quietly in the doorway. "His Grace has arrived." Every woman in the drawing-room straightened immediately. Clara did not look up at first. She did not wish to reveal how absurdly relieved she felt hearing those words. Moments later, Adrian Ashbourne entered the room still wearing his dark riding coat dusted lightly with winter frost. Cold air followed him inside alongside the sharp scent of cedar and snow. Conversation stopped almost instantly. The Duke acknowledged the room with a brief nod before his gaze found Clara near the windows. As always, she felt strangely examined under those gray eyes. Not admired. Seen. "Your Grace," Lady Beatrice greeted smoothly. "What an unexpected pleasure." Adrian removed his gloves slowly. "Is it?" The same answer he had given Edmund days earlier. Clara almost laughed. Apparently the Duke possessed little patience for decorative social language. Lady Pembroke brightened visibly. "Your Grace, we were just discussing the unfortunate inheritance circumstances." Adrian's expression remained perfectly neutral. Dangerous sign. Clara recognized it now. The calmer he appeared, the sharper his next words usually became. "Indeed?" he asked. "Such a pity for poor Miss Whitmore," the woman continued. "One hopes she will recover from the disappointment soon." Adrian glanced briefly toward Clara. "Recover?" Lady Pembroke smiled uncertainly. "Well, inheriting so little must naturally feel devastating for a young woman." The Duke removed one glove finger by finger before answering. "In my experience, Lady Pembroke, women survive disappointment considerably better than society survives underestimating them." Silence. Absolute silence. Clara lowered her eyes quickly to hide the dangerous warmth rising beneath her skin. Lady Pembroke blinked repeatedly. Lydia looked confused. Lady Beatrice suddenly appeared interested in the fireplace. Adrian turned toward Clara directly. "Miss Whitmore." She stood carefully. "Your Grace, I require your assistance regarding several estate documents." Lady Beatrice smiled too quickly. "Surely those matters may wait until after tea." "No," Adrian said. "One word. Calm. Final." Clara set aside her book immediately. The Duke extended his arm with formal politeness. She hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand lightly against his sleeve. Warmth traveled unexpectedly through the fabric barrier anyway. As they crossed the corridor outside together, Clara became acutely aware of every servant pretending not to stare. "You enjoy terrifying drawing rooms," she murmured quietly once they reached the marble staircase. Adrian glanced toward her. "I enjoy discouraging stupidity. You accomplish both admirably." Something faint touched his expression again. That near smile she rarely saw. "You handled yourself well." Clara looked ahead carefully while they descended the stairs side by side. "I nearly informed Lady Pembroke precisely where she could place her sympathy. Restraint is often more intimidating. You sound unfortunately experienced in intimidation." "I am." The honesty startled her enough that she laughed softly beneath her breath. Adrian looked toward her again. "What?" "Nothing. That is twice this week you have laughed near me." Clara blinked. "You count." "I notice." The quiet reply unsettled her far more than flirtation would have, because it did not feel flirtatious. It felt observant, intentional, dangerous in entirely different ways. Outside, a sleek black carriage bearing the Ravenshire crest waited near the front steps beneath pale gray skies. Clara stopped short. "We are leaving?" Briefly, Adrian helped her into the carriage before entering after her. The interior smelled faintly of leather and winter air. Thick velvet curtains softened the weak daylight while the carriage lurched smoothly forward moments later. Clara settled opposite him across the narrow compartment. "Where are we going?" "London." "Without warning my family?" "Correct." Clara stared at him. "You abduct women with remarkable confidence, Your Grace." Adrian folded his gloves neatly beside him. "If I intended abduction, Miss Whitmore, you would not be sitting near the door." Clara looked away quickly before her expression betrayed amusement. Snow-dusted countryside rolled past beyond the carriage windows while silence settled briefly between them. Not uncomfortable silence. Worse, easy silence. The sort capable of becoming dangerous if allowed to continue too long. Adrian finally reached into his coat and withdrew several folded papers. "I visited Ravenshire Holdings this morning before coming to Whitmore Hall." Clara accepted the documents carefully. Her eyes widened almost immediately. "These are consortium reports." "Correct. Why are you showing them to me?" Adrian studied her face carefully. "Because your name appears repeatedly inside them." Clara's pulse quickened again. Several pages indeed referenced voting allocations connected to Atlantic trade routes and shipping interests. Her father's signature appeared beside multiple transactions. So did Adrian's. "I do not understand any of this," she admitted quietly. "You will." "That sounds ominous." "It is practical." The carriage turned sharply onto rougher roads. Clara steadied herself against the seat instinctively just as another jolt sent several papers slipping from her lap onto the carriage floor. Adrian reached down simultaneously. Their hands collided near the scattered documents. Warm fingers closed briefly around hers before either could withdraw. Clara froze. So did he. The moment lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Yet something shifted inside the quiet carriage all the same. Not dramatic. Worse. Awareness. Adrian released her hand first. "My apologies." His voice sounded lower now. Clara gathered the papers quickly. "Entirely unnecessary." Silence returned immediately afterward. He looked out the window. Clara pretended enormous interest in shipping reports she barely understood. Her heartbeat refused to behave properly for the next 15 minutes. By the time the carriage entered London proper beneath darkening afternoon skies, Clara had almost regained composure. Almost. Adrian finally spoke again as gas lamps flickered alive along crowded streets outside. There is another matter. Clara looked up cautiously. What matter? Lady Ashcombe's ball tomorrow evening. She frowned slightly. What about it? Adrian's expression remained unreadable. You will attend with me. Clara stared at him. I beg your pardon? Society already watches you. Exactly why I hoped to avoid entering a ballroom beside the most feared duke in England. That is precisely why you should. Clara exhaled slowly. You truly enjoy forcing people into uncomfortable situations. No, his eyes held hers steadily now. I dislike watching intelligent women retreat because lesser people attempt to humiliate them. The carriage seemed suddenly too small again. Too quiet. Clara looked toward the glowing London streets outside before answering softly. And what exactly do you expect tomorrow evening to accomplish? Adrian's gaze never left her face. I expect every person mocking you this week to reconsider doing so publicly while you stand beside me. Her breath caught before she could stop it. Because she believed him. Entirely. And somehow that frightened her more than the whispers ever had. Lady Ashcombe's ballroom glittered like a kingdom determined to ignore winter. Crystal chandeliers blazed above polished marble floors while a sea of silk gowns and black evening coats moved through the grand hall beneath the swell of violins and carefully practiced laughter. London society had gathered in full force despite the cold. Dukes, earls, parliament ministers, heiresses draped in diamonds large enough to feed villages. Every important family in the city seemed to have arrived for the first truly significant ball of the season. And nearly all of them turned to stare the moment Clara Whitmore entered beside Adrian Ashbourne. The reaction rippled outward almost physically. Conversations slowed. Fans paused mid-motion. Gentlemen straightened. Mothers with unmarried daughters looked simultaneously fascinated and alarmed. Clara felt the weight of attention instantly beneath her skin. Not because she was beautiful tonight, though Lady Ashcombe's dressmaker had transformed her dark sapphire silk gown into something quietly striking against her chestnut hair and pale skin. No, the room stared because she had arrived on the arm of the Duke of Ravenshire. Dear God! A woman whispered somewhere near the entrance. That is Clara Whitmore. Impossible. No, it is her. Why is she with Ravenshire? Adrian did not slow his pace. His expression remained cool and unreadable as he guided Clara through the ballroom beneath hundreds of watchful eyes. Somehow that calm steadied her more than reassurance would have. He expected scrutiny. He survived it daily. You were correct, Clara murmured softly as they crossed the marble floor. People are speaking. Let them. Easy advice from a man who terrifies half the room on sight. Adrian glanced toward her briefly. Closer to 3/4. Against all logic, Clara nearly laughed. The orchestra shifted into a graceful waltz while servants glided between guests carrying silver trays of champagne beneath golden candlelight. Everywhere Clara looked, whispers followed them. Some curious, some openly speculative, a few cruel. Lady Clara. Lord Pembroke approached with a smile too polished to be sincere. How unexpected to see you this evening. Clara recognized him immediately as one of Edmund's frequent gambling companions. Lord Pembroke. His eyes slid toward Adrian cautiously before returning to her. I had heard Whitmore Hall entered a rather delicate period following your father's passing. Delicate. Such a civilized word for public humiliation. Grief often appears delicate from outside it, Clara replied calmly. Something flickered across Adrian's expression beside her. Approval again. Lord Pembroke cleared his throat awkwardly. Quite. Before he could continue, another voice interrupted nearby. Ravenshire. A tall gentleman in silver evening attire approached with visible curiosity. You vanish for half the season only to arrive escorting the most discussed woman in London. Adrian's gaze cooled several degrees. Then London requires more interesting discussions. Clara nearly smiled. The gentleman laughed uncertainly. You always did enjoy frightening people. No, Adrian replied calmly. People simply frighten themselves. More guests approached after that. Some polite, others painfully obvious in their attempts to investigate the mystery surrounding Clara's inheritance and sudden connection to the Duke. Through all of it, Adrian remained beside her with unnerving steadiness. Never possessive, never theatrical, simply present. Yet somehow his presence altered everything around them. No one dared openly mock her tonight. No one risked visible pity. The Duke of Ravenshire had made Clara Whitmore untouchable merely by standing near her. The realization unsettled her more than she cared to admit. An hour later, Clara stood near the edge of the ballroom accepting champagne she had no intention of drinking while Adrian spoke briefly with two members of Parliament nearby. Candlelight flickered softly across the crowd. Music swelled around her. And for the first time in weeks, she almost forgot the humiliation waiting beneath society's smiles. "You look remarkably comfortable for a ruined woman." Clara turned sharply. Lydia stood beside her in pale silver silk, diamonds glittering at her throat while amusement curved her lips too sweetly to trust. Clara's chest tightened instantly. "Lydia," her younger sister smiled brightly. "You did not tell us you planned to arrive with Ravenshire. You did not ask." "No," Lydia sipped champagne lightly. "Mother assumed even you would possess too much pride for that." Clara stared at her carefully. "For what exactly?" "Using a duke to restore your reputation." The cruelty landed softly, delicately, precisely because Lydia understood exactly where to place the blade. Clara set down her untouched champagne before she dropped the glass entirely. "You mistake me for someone interested in restoration." Lydia's smile sharpened. "Do I?" She leaned slightly closer. "Everyone in this room knows he pities you." Clara felt heat rise beneath her skin despite herself. "That is enough. Is it?" Lydia glanced toward Adrian across the ballroom. "Men like Ravenshire do not rescue women without reason. You appear unusually invested in my circumstances." "I am invested in avoiding scandal attached to our family." Lydia lowered her voice further. "People are already wondering what promises you made to secure his attention." Clara stared at her in disbelief. "You cannot possibly believe that." "Can I not?" The answer struck harder because Lydia sounded genuinely uncertain. As though years inside aristocratic society had taught her women only gained powerful protection through manipulation or desperation. Clara suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. "I once believed you kinder than this," she said quietly. Lydia's expression flickered. Brief guilt, gone almost immediately. "And I once believed father intended fairness." Clara froze. Slowly, she turned toward her sister completely. "What does that mean?" Lydia looked away first. "Mistake." Clara noticed immediately. "Lydia." Her sister exhaled sharply through her nose. "Nothing. Do not lie to me. You truly wish honesty?" Lydia's voice tightened now beneath years of polished social sweetness. "Very well. Father adored you. Everyone knew it." Clara blinked. "What?" "You were always the clever one, the trustworthy one, the daughter he actually spoke to." Hurt flashed across Lydia's face before she masked it quickly. "Meanwhile, Edmund received responsibility without affection, and I received expectations without freedom." Clara stared at her speechless. "That is absurd." "Is it?" Lydia laughed softly without humor. "Why do you think Mother worried so desperately near the end? Why do you think Edmund argued constantly with Father these past months?" Clara's pulse quickened violently. "What are you saying?" Lydia looked toward the crowded ballroom around them before lowering her voice further. "Father planned to change everything." The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara's feet. "No, he did." Lydia swallowed once. "I heard them arguing 2 weeks before he died. Edmund accused Father of destroying the family for your sake." Clara felt suddenly cold despite the overheated ballroom. "Destroying what family?" "The inheritance." Lydia's eyes finally met hers fully now. "Edmund said Father intended to transfer controlling estate interests away from him." Clara stared in disbelief. "That is impossible." "Mother thought so too." Lydia's voice softened strangely, almost sadly. "Until she discovered the documents." Every sound in the ballroom seemed to blur together suddenly. violins, laughter, crystal glasses. Clara barely heard any of it. "What documents?" she whispered. Lydia hesitated too long. "Lydia, papers hidden in Father's study," she admitted quietly. "Mother found them months ago." Clara's breath stopped. "The hidden room." Lydia frowned slightly. "What hidden room?" Realization struck Clara instantly. Lydia knew only part of the truth. Not all of it. Adrian appeared beside them before she could respond further. His expression sharpened immediately upon seeing Clara's face. "What happened?" Lydia straightened at once. "Nothing at all, Your Grace." Adrian ignored her entirely. His gaze remained fixed on Clara. "Miss Whitmore." The concern beneath the calmness startled her more than the question itself. "I am fine," Clara managed softly. Adrian clearly did not believe her. "Lydia was merely explaining family history," Clara added carefully. Something dangerous flickered through the Duke's eyes at that. Lydia curtsied lightly. "If you will excuse me." She disappeared quickly into the crowd before Adrian could stop her. Clara stared after her sister numbly. "What did she tell you?" Adrian asked quietly. Clara looked up at him slowly. "My father planned to alter the inheritance before he died." The Duke's expression hardened instantly. Not surprise. Confirmation. "You already knew," Clara whispered. Silence answered her first. Then Adrian spoke carefully. "I suspected." Hurt moved unexpectedly through her chest. "You continue withholding pieces of this from me, because I do not yet know whom to trust. You trust me enough to drag me into London ballrooms. I trust you with your own future." His voice remained calm but firmer now. "That is considerably different." Clara looked away sharply before emotion betrayed itself across her face. Around them the ballroom continued glittering with music and laughter, entirely unaware that her entire life had apparently been built atop hidden resentments and secrets. "Clara." Her name sounded different in his voice tonight. Softer somehow. She closed her eyes briefly. "Did my father truly intend to leave everything to me?" Adrian answered after a long silence. "No." Clara looked back at him immediately. "Then what?" His gray eyes held hers steadily beneath the golden ballroom light. "Something far more dangerous than everything." The drive back from Lady Ashcombe's ball unfolded beneath a sky heavy with approaching snow. London faded gradually behind the carriage windows while silence settled thickly between Clara and Adrian. Not hostile silence. Worse, thoughtful silence. The kind that forced every unanswered question to grow larger. Clara sat across from him wrapped in dark velvet and confusion while gas lamps flickered past outside like fading stars. "You said my father intended to leave me something dangerous," she said at last. Adrian's gaze lifted slowly from the documents resting beside him. "Yes. You continue saying things that sound ominous and then refusing to explain them. Because certainty matters before accusation." Clara folded her hands tightly in her lap. "And when exactly do I receive certainty?" Adrian studied her for several long seconds before answering. "Sooner than your family would prefer." The carriage rolled over uneven stone streets before turning toward quieter roads leading north of the city. Snow began drifting softly beyond the windows now, pale against the darkness. Clara looked down briefly at the silver embroidery along her gloves. "Lydia heard arguments before Father died," she said quietly. "She believes Edmund and Lady Beatrice discovered part of the inheritance changes." Adrian's expression sharpened immediately. "What exactly did she say?" Clara repeated the conversation carefully. By the time she finished, the Duke had become very still beside the opposite seat. "Interesting," he murmured. Clara frowned. "You keep using that word when things are clearly alarming. The two are often related." She exhaled softly through her nose. "You are impossible." Frequently, against her better judgment, the corner of Clara's mouth lifted slightly. Adrian noticed immediately. Of course he did. The carriage finally slowed before the illuminated entrance of Ravenshire House, the Duke's enormous London residence overlooking Grosvenor Square. Clara blinked in surprise. "Why are we here?" Because I do not intend to discuss sensitive financial documents inside Whitmore Hall tonight. A footman opened the carriage door moments later, while snow drifted softly across marble steps lit by enormous lanterns. Clara hesitated briefly before accepting Adrian's offered hand. Warmth traveled instantly through her glove again. Inside, Ravenshire House felt less like a residence and more like controlled power made architectural. Dark marble floors stretched beneath vaulted ceilings painted with fading mythological scenes. Massive fireplaces glowed warmly against winter cold while servants moved through the mansion with near-military precision. Clara had attended political receptions here years earlier during London seasons, though never beyond the public entertaining rooms. Tonight felt entirely different. Personal somehow. Dangerous word. Adrian removed his coat as a servant approached. "No visitors," he instructed calmly, "and no interruptions unless Parliament burns down." "Yes, Your Grace." Clara nearly laughed despite herself while the servant disappeared without visible reaction. "Your staff appears accustomed to dramatic instructions." Adrian gestured toward a corridor lined with oil portraits. "My staff is accustomed to Parliament." He led her into a private library far smaller than the grand rooms downstairs. Warm amber light flickered across towering bookshelves and deep green leather chairs arranged beside a fire large enough to heat the entire chamber. Unlike the formal spaces elsewhere in the house, this room felt lived in. Papers rested across tables. Half-read books remained open near the hearth. A chessboard sat abandoned beside crystal decanters. Clara paused just inside the doorway. "This is not what I expected." Adrian glanced toward her while pouring 2 glasses of water from a crystal pitcher. "What did you expect?" "Something colder." Something unreadable moved briefly through his expression before vanishing again. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore." For nearly an hour they reviewed the documents recovered from the hidden room at Whitmore Hall while snow thickened outside Ravenshire House. Adrian explained consortium structures, trade voting systems, and shipping control routes with ruthless clarity, while Clara struggled to absorb the implications. Her father had quietly transferred substantial voting influence connected to Atlantic shipping operations into her name months before his death. Influence powerful enough to shift trade negotiations across England and America alike. "This is insanity," Clara whispered finally. "Why would father involve me in something this enormous?" Adrian set aside another ledger. "Because he trusted you." That answer becomes less comforting each time you repeat it. Something dangerously close to amusement touched his face. "Fair." Clara leaned back against the leather chair, exhausted. And if Edmund or Lady Beatrice discovered these shares existed, then they would possess substantial motivation to control the remaining inheritance narrative. Her stomach tightened coldly. "You truly believe they manipulated father near the end?" Adrian's gaze held hers steadily. "I believe your father became increasingly isolated while challenging people financially dependent upon his silence." Before Clara could respond, sharp voices echoed suddenly from the corridor outside. Both of them looked toward the library door immediately. A moment later it opened without announcement. Lady Beatrice swept into the room wrapped in midnight blue velvet and fury carefully disguised as elegance. Edmund followed close behind looking pale and deeply uncomfortable. Clara rose instantly in shock. "What are you doing here?" Lady Beatrice's eyes swept across the room before settling on Adrian. "I might ask the same question, Your Grace." Adrian remained seated beside the fire, entirely calm, entirely dangerous. "You entered my residence uninvited," he observed mildly. "I assumed urgency." Lady Beatrice ignored the insult completely. "Clara." Her voice sharpened beneath the polished exterior. "You disappeared from the ball without explanation." Clara stared at her stepmother carefully. "I was not aware permission remained necessary." Edmund stepped forward quickly. "That is not fair." "No." Clara turned toward him. "Which part specifically?" Tension tightened instantly across the library. Snow drifted silently beyond the windows while the fire cracked softly behind Adrian's chair. Lady Beatrice regained composure first. "Of course she did. This family has suffered enough scandal already. she said coolly. London is talking. London is always talking, Adrian replied before Clara could answer. Lady Beatrice's eyes flashed toward him. And you appear determined to encourage it. Public speculation rarely concerns me. Perhaps it should when attached to vulnerable young women. The implication landed heavily in the room. Clara went still instantly. Edmund looked horrified. Adrian's expression changed so subtly another person might have missed it entirely. Clara did not. The room seemed colder suddenly. Careful, the Duke said quietly. Lady Beatrice lifted her chin. I merely observe appearances. Then allow me to clarify appearances for you. Adrian rose slowly from his chair. The movement alone altered the atmosphere inside the library. Miss Whitmore is under my personal protection, while matters concerning her father's estate remain unresolved. Silence crashed down over the room. Edmund stared openly. Lady Beatrice's face lost color beneath careful makeup. Clara's pulse stumbled hard against her ribs. Under my personal protection. The words felt dangerous in entirely new ways. Lady Beatrice recovered first. Protection? She repeated carefully. From whom? Adrian's gray eyes held hers without warmth. An excellent question. Clara watched genuine fear flicker across her stepmother's face before disappearing beneath anger. You overstep considerably, Your Grace. Frequently. Lady Beatrice stepped closer toward Clara. Come home. No, the answer escaped before Clara fully considered it. Silence followed immediately. Even she looked startled by the certainty in her own voice. Edmund frowned. Clara. She turned toward him slowly. Did you know father intended to alter the inheritance? His face changed instantly. Not guilt exactly. Worse. Shame. Clara felt something inside her chest crack quietly. You did. Edmund looked away first. It was complicated. No, she whispered. It was deliberate. Lady Beatrice stepped in sharply. Your father was ill. He became irrational near the end. Adrian spoke before Clara could. Interesting. Because every financial record I reviewed suggests Lord Whitmore became considerably more rational before his death. The color drained from Edmund's face. Lady Beatrice turned toward the Duke fully now. You have no right involving yourself in private family matters. Incorrect. Adrian's voice remained calm. Lord Whitmore granted me that right personally. Through manipulation? She snapped suddenly. Or perhaps through Clara herself? The accusation hung viciously in the air. Clara felt humiliation strike instantly beneath her skin. Not because she believed it. Because everyone in the room understood exactly what Lady Beatrice implied. That Clara had somehow secured the Duke's loyalty through feminine calculation rather than intelligence or trust. Edmund looked horrified again. Mother. No, Lady Beatrice continued coldly, eyes fixed on Clara now. Perhaps it is time someone said aloud what society already whispers. You arrive publicly beside one of England's most powerful dukes days after inheriting nothing, and suddenly, he controls every conversation surrounding this family. Clara's throat tightened painfully. Stop. Do not pretend innocence now. That is enough. Adrian's voice cut through the room with frightening quiet. Every person froze. The Duke stepped forward slowly until he stood directly beside Clara. Not touching her. Worse. Choosing a side visibly. You will apologize to Miss Whitmore, he said calmly. Now. Lady Beatrice stared at him in disbelief. Excuse me? Adrian's expression never changed. You insulted her character inside my house. The silence became suffocating. Clara could feel servants somewhere beyond the library doorway pretending not to listen. Edmund looked moments away from collapse entirely. Lady Beatrice lifted her chin with brittle dignity. I spoke honestly. Adrian's eyes hardened into something terrifyingly cold. No, he said softly. You spoke cruelly because you are frightened. The words landed like shattered glass. Lady Beatrice went pale instantly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, Clara realized her stepmother was no longer controlling the conversation at all. Adrian Ashbourne was, completely, No one moved for several unbearable seconds after Adrian's final words settled across the library. The fire crackled softly behind him while snow drifted against the tall windows overlooking Grosvenor Square. Clara could hear her own heartbeat now. Sharp, uneven. Lady Beatrice stood frozen near the center of the room, her gloved hands trembling almost invisibly beneath folds of midnight velvet. Edmund looked trapped somewhere between panic and shame. Adrian remained perfectly calm beside Clara, which somehow made him infinitely more intimidating. "I am not frightened," Lady Beatrice said at last, though the confidence in her voice had cracked noticeably. Adrian's gaze never left her face. "Then you are remarkably defensive for a woman with nothing to hide." Clara watched the color drain slowly from her stepmother's expression. Edmund stepped forward immediately. "This has gone far enough." Adrian finally looked toward him. "Has it? You are turning private grief into public scandal." "No," Adrian replied quietly. "Your family accomplished that before I arrived." Silence again, heavy and suffocating. Clara looked toward Edmund carefully. "Did father confront you before he died?" Her brother's jaw tightened instantly. "Clara, answer me." He looked away briefly. Mistake. She recognized that now. "Father misunderstood several financial matters," Edmund said carefully. "He became suspicious near the end. Suspicious enough to rewrite legal structures and hide documents behind walls?" Adrian asked mildly. Edmund's face hardened. "You have no proof of wrongdoing." "Not yet." The words landed with frightening certainty. Lady Beatrice suddenly straightened. Clara watched composure return to her stepmother piece by piece like armor rebuilt beneath candlelight. "Very well," she said coolly. "If accusations are to continue, then perhaps truths should continue as well." Adrian's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "Meaning?" Lady Beatrice looked directly at Clara now. "Your father did not merely alter financial arrangements before his death." Clara's stomach tightened instantly. "What are you talking about?" "There are matters concerning your inheritance your father never explained properly." "Then explain them now." Lady Beatrice hesitated. For one brief second, genuine uncertainty crossed her face, as though even she understood the danger of whatever came next. Then the moment vanished. "Your grandmother left a separate trust before her death." Clara blinked. "My grandmother?" "Yes." Edmund looked sharply toward his mother. "We agreed not to discuss this." Adrian noticed immediately. So did Clara. "Agreed?" she repeated softly. Edmund cursed under his breath. Lady Beatrice ignored him. "Your maternal grandmother established a private inheritance structure nearly 20 years ago." Clara stared at her in confusion. "That makes no sense. Father always said grandmother possessed very little money." "Your father lied." The room fell silent again. Clara felt cold move through her chest. "Why would he do that?" Lady Beatrice laughed softly without humor. "Because the truth complicated everything." Adrian stepped slightly closer toward Clara. Protective. Instinctive. She noticed despite herself. "Continue," he said calmly. Lady Beatrice folded her hands tightly together. "Your grandmother's family controlled extensive trade investments in America before the Revolutionary War. Most holdings were lost afterward. Or so everyone believed." Clara frowned slightly. "What does that have to do with me?" The surviving assets were reorganized privately through shipping consortiums decades later. Lady Beatrice's eyes hardened. "Your father eventually gained access through your mother's bloodline." Adrian went completely still beside Clara. "Interesting," he murmured softly. Lady Beatrice glanced sharply toward him. "You already knew." "Not this part." Clara looked between them both, struggling to understand. "Someone explain this clearly." Adrian answered first. "Your grandmother's family maintained ownership interests hidden through Atlantic trade corporations." Clara stared blankly. And those ownership interests increased dramatically over time. Understanding arrived slowly, terribly. "The consortium shares." Adrian nodded once. Clara felt dizzy suddenly. "You are saying those shares belong to my mother's family?" Originally, Lady Beatrice replied coldly, your father merely controlled them temporarily. Clara's thoughts raced painfully. Then why hide them? Edmund answered before anyone else could. Because if Parliament discovered how much influence those shares carried, every investor connected to Whitmore shipping interests would demand control. Adrian's eyes shifted sharply toward him. You understand the consortium structure remarkably well. Edmund looked trapped again. Father explained enough eventually. Clara stared at her brother. You knew about the shares. Silence. Then finally, quietly, Edmund answered. Not everything, but enough. He closed his eyes briefly. Yes. Hurt struck harder than Clara expected. Not because of the money, because everyone around her apparently knew fragments of truths she herself had been denied for years. Adrian watched her carefully now. Clara. She stepped away instinctively. No, her voice trembled despite herself. Do not look at me like that. Like what? Like I am about to break. Silence. Then Adrian answered quietly. I do not think you break easily. The words nearly undid her anyway. Clara turned away sharply toward the fire while emotion tightened painfully in her throat. Across the room, Lady Beatrice watched with strange bitterness. Your father always believed strength made you special, she said softly. Clara looked back immediately. What is that supposed to mean? It means he spent years preparing you for responsibilities he never intended Edmund to carry. Edmund laughed once under his breath. Hollow. Exhausted. There it is. Clara stared at him. You knew. Of course I knew. He looked at her fully now for the first time all evening. Do you think it feels wonderful growing up understanding your father trusts your younger sister more than his own heir? Clara recoiled slightly. I never wanted any of this. That changes nothing. Pain flickered across his face before anger buried it quickly again. Father spent years treating me like a placeholder while quietly educating you about estate management, shipping law, political negotiations. Clara blinked in shock. He discussed those things with me because I listened. Exactly. Edmund's laugh sharpened bitterly. You listened. I disappointed him. Lydia entertained society. And father built contingency plans around you instead. The room seemed to tighten around Clara. Memories returned suddenly. Evenings spent beside her father's study fire discussing trade routes while Edmund attended gambling clubs in London. Long conversations about shipping taxes and parliamentary corruption she once assumed harmless intellectual interests. Her father teaching her how contracts functioned because understanding money prevents dependence. Dear God, Adrian spoke quietly into the silence. Lord Whitmore believed Miss Whitmore capable of protecting the consortium. Lady Beatrice's expression hardened immediately. And that was precisely the problem. Clara looked toward her sharply. Why? Because once your father became obsessed with transferring influence into your control, he endangered every person financially tied to Whitmore Hall. Lady Beatrice stepped forward slowly now. Do you understand how many fortunes depended upon those shipping shares remaining hidden? Clara's pulse quickened violently. You manipulated the estate records because father threatened your access. No, Lady Beatrice replied coldly. I protected this family from collapse. Adrian's voice turned dangerously quiet. By stealing from it? Lady Beatrice met his gaze directly. By surviving. Silence followed. Clara suddenly saw her stepmother differently. Not simply cruel. Desperate. Terrified of losing security in a world where aristocratic women without money became socially invisible almost overnight. You altered the inheritance, Clara whispered. Lady Beatrice looked away briefly. Your father became unreasonable near the end. That is not an answer. No, her eyes returned toward Clara. It is the truth. Adrian moved toward the desk near the fire and opened one of the ledgers retrieved from Whitmore Hall. Then perhaps we should discuss additional truths. He withdrew a folded document carefully, including why Lord Whitmore transferred legal authority over the consortium shares entirely into Miss Whitmore's name 6 months before his death. Clara froze. So did Edmund. Lady Beatrice went visibly pale. Adrian unfolded the document slowly beneath the library candlelight. According to this transfer record, Miss Whitmore now controls a majority voting position connected to every Atlantic shipping route tied to the consortium. Clara stared at him in disbelief. Majority? Adrian's eyes lifted toward her steadily. Your father did not leave you money, Clara. The sound of her name in his voice felt strangely intimate inside the silent library. He left you power. No one spoke afterward, because suddenly every cruel whisper, every altered ledger, every hidden document, every frightened glance finally made terrible, perfect sense. The library remained silent long after Adrian's final words faded into the firelit room. Clara stood motionless near the hearth while snow drifted steadily beyond the tall windows of Ravenshire house. Power. The word echoed through her thoughts with terrifying weight. Not fortune. Not jewelry. Not a dowry carefully measured for marriage negotiations. Real power. Parliamentary power. Trade power. Enough influence to make aristocratic families panic behind polite smiles. Enough to make her father hide documents inside secret rooms and trust only one man in England with the truth. Edmund lowered himself heavily into one of the leather chairs near the desk as though his legs no longer fully supported him. Father lost his mind, he muttered quietly. Adrian closed the ledger with controlled precision. No, his gaze shifted toward Clara. I believe your father became clearer than ever before his death. Lady Beatrice laughed once beneath her breath. Brittle. Sharp. You speak as though this arrangement was noble. I speak as though it was deliberate. Clara finally found her voice. How much influence are we discussing exactly? Adrian answered without hesitation. Enough that several members of Parliament would prefer these documents remain buried permanently. Cold spread through her chest instantly. That is not reassuring. It is honest. Lady Beatrice stepped toward the fireplace, eyes fixed on Clara now with strange intensity. Do you finally understand why your father endangered us? Clara stared back at her. You manipulated estate accounts to protect stability. By stealing. By surviving. The older woman's composure cracked slightly for the first time all evening. You think power protects women like me? It does not. Men control Parliament. Men control inheritance law. Men control banks. Your father's obsession with placing influence into your hands threatened every arrangement keeping Whitmore Hall afloat. Clara looked toward Edmund slowly. And you agreed with her. He rubbed one hand across his face wearily. I agreed. Father became reckless. Hurt moved through Clara again. Quieter this time. Less shocking now that truth continued arriving in pieces sharp enough to wound everyone involved. Adrian stepped forward before silence could deepen further. This conversation ends tonight. Lady Beatrice's eyes flashed. You do not command this family. No, Adrian replied calmly. I merely understand consequences better than you appear to. The warning settled heavily through the room. Edmund looked toward the Duke carefully. What happens now? Adrian's expression hardened slightly. Now we confirm every transfer record and determine precisely how much interference occurred before Lord Whitmore died. Lady Beatrice folded her arms tightly. And if the documents disappear before then? Adrian's gaze met hers fully. They will not. Something about the certainty in his voice made even Clara believe him completely. A long silence followed before Lady Beatrice finally turned toward the door. Come, Edmund. He hesitated briefly, eyes shifting toward Clara. Guilt lingered there now beneath exhaustion and resentment. I never intended this to become ugly, he said quietly. Clara almost laughed at the absurd understatement. Instead she answered softly. It became ugly long before I understood why. Edmund lowered his gaze. Then he followed his mother from the library without another word. The door closed behind them with quiet finality. Silence returned immediately afterward. Different now. Less combative. More dangerous somehow because only Clara and Adrian remained inside the warm amber light of the library, while snow fell endlessly beyond the windows. Clara exhaled slowly and sank into the nearest chair beside the fire. Exhaustion settled over her all at once. Emotional exhaustion. the kind that hollowed out thought itself. Adrian watched her quietly for several moments before crossing toward a side table near the hearth. He poured fresh water into a crystal glass and handed it to her without speaking. Clara accepted it carefully. "Thank you. You are pale. I discovered tonight that my father secretly transferred political influence large enough to frighten Parliament, while my family apparently spent months dismantling each other behind closed doors." She took a slow breath. Paleness feels appropriate. Something faintly softer entered Adrian's expression. Fair observation. Clara stared down into the glass resting between her hands. "Did you know all of this from the beginning?" "No, most of it." Silence answered first. Then Adrian moved toward the fire and rested one arm lightly against the marble mantel. "Your father contacted me 11 months ago," he said quietly. At first he believed estate funds were simply being mishandled. Gambling losses, poor management, typical aristocratic stupidity. Clara looked up despite herself. "You possess remarkable affection for the aristocracy." "I possess experience." The answer nearly drew another exhausted laugh from her. Adrian continued, "Then your father uncovered evidence connected to the consortium shares. And he trusted you immediately?" "No," something darker crossed his face briefly. "Lord Whitmore trusted very carefully." Clara studied him through flickering firelight. "Then why you?" Adrian was silent long enough that she nearly assumed he would not answer. Finally he spoke. "Because years ago, when my family faced financial ruin after my mother's death, your father intervened privately before anyone in London discovered how vulnerable Ravenshire truly was." Clara remembered fragments suddenly. Whispers during old London seasons about a brief financial scare involving shipping losses at Ravenshire Holdings. Nothing public. Nothing detailed. "He protected your family." Adrian nodded once. "And later he asked me to protect you." The words settled quietly between them. Clara's chest tightened unexpectedly. "He actually said that?" Adrian reached into the inner pocket of his waistcoat and withdrew a folded letter worn soft at the edges from repeated handling. "Read it." Clara accepted the paper slowly. Her father's handwriting greeted her immediately. "Adrian, if matters worsen before I can settle them properly, promise me Clara will not stand alone against what follows. She is stronger than most men realize, but strength does not prevent isolation." Clara stopped breathing for a moment. Firelight blurred softly through sudden tears gathering in her eyes. He knew. Somehow her father had known exactly what would happen after his death. Adrian's voice lowered quietly beside the fire. "He wrote that 3 weeks before he died." Clara folded the letter carefully before emotion could overwhelm her entirely. "And you promised him?" "Yes." "Out of loyalty?" Another long silence. Adrian's gray eyes remained fixed on the fire rather than her face now. "At first." Clara's pulse quickened unexpectedly. Dangerous answer. Very dangerous. She looked down quickly at the folded letter in her hands. "You should not make promises to dying men lightly." "I rarely make promises at all." The honesty in his voice unsettled her more than tenderness would have. Clara stood slowly and crossed toward the tall library windows, needing distance from both the fire and the strange tension tightening the room. Snow-covered Grosvenor Square entirely now beneath silver moonlight. London looked softer in winter, less cruel from a distance. "Everyone keeps discussing my strength," she said quietly, "as though that somehow prevents fear." Adrian moved beside her after several moments. Not too close, never too close. Yet his presence filled the silence anyway. "Are you frightened?" Clara laughed softly without humor. "I inherited enough influence to terrify members of Parliament, discovered my family manipulated financial records, and apparently became the center of a private war before understanding any of it." She looked up at him finally. "What do you think?" Adrian's gaze held hers steadily. "I think fear is rational. That is the least comforting thing anyone has ever said to me." Comfort was not the intention. Clara shook her head slightly. "Of course not." Silence drifted between them again while snow continued falling outside. Adrian finally spoke without looking away. You are handling this remarkably well. Clara swallowed unexpectedly. No, I am handling it quietly. Something changed in his expression then. Subtle. Real. There is a difference, he said softly. The room suddenly felt too small again. Too warm. Clara looked away first toward the snow-covered square below. Why do you keep watching me like that? The question escaped before she could stop it. Silence followed immediately. Then Adrian answered with dangerous honesty. Because everyone else in your life underestimated you. Her breath caught. He stepped slightly closer. Not enough to touch. Enough that she became aware of every inch separating them anyway. And because, he continued quietly, you continue standing after truths that would have destroyed many people already. Clara's heartbeat stumbled hard beneath her ribs. You make endurance sound admirable. It is. The word landed softly. Certainly. Clara looked up at him slowly. Firelight flickered across the sharp lines of his face while snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows behind them. For the first time since this nightmare began, she realized something terrifyingly simple. Adrian Ashbourne no longer protected her merely because of a promise made to her father. And somehow, deep down, she suspected he had realized it too. By the following afternoon, London had transformed suspicion into scandal. Clara understood this the moment the first newspaper arrived at Ravenshire House. The folded society column rested beside Adrian's untouched breakfast tray like a loaded weapon disguised as polite journalism. She knew something was wrong before she even opened it. Servants avoided her eyes. The atmosphere inside the dining room felt strained beneath the quiet clatter of silver and porcelain. Adrian stood near the windows overlooking Grosvenor Square, already dressed for Parliament in dark charcoal wool. One hand resting against the back of his chair while snow melted slowly beyond the glass. Do not read it if you prefer peace this morning, he said calmly. Clara looked down at the newspaper anyway. The headline itself remained harmless enough. Winter balls continued despite mourning season. But beneath it, tucked carefully into the society commentary, came the real damage. Whispers surrounding the late Lord Whitmore's daughter continue following her increasingly public association with the Duke of Ravenshire. Questions remain regarding the young lady's sudden influence over several private estate matters despite her apparent lack of inheritance. Some suggest feminine persuasion may have accomplished what legal standing could not. Clara felt heat rush instantly beneath her skin. Not shock. Worse. Humiliation sharpened into something colder because she understood exactly how aristocratic society functioned. The article never directly accused her of impropriety. It merely invited others to do so privately. Adrian crossed the room before she could finish reading. Without a word, he removed the newspaper from her hands and folded it closed again. Enough! Clara laughed softly beneath her breath. Apparently London believes I seduced you for access to estate records. London frequently believes idiotic things. Yes, but this particular idiocy concerns my reputation. Adrian's jaw tightened almost invisibly. Your reputation remains intact. Clara looked toward him carefully. That is easy for a duke to say. Silence followed, because they both knew the truth. Men survived gossip. Women rarely did. A footman entered moments later carrying fresh correspondence on a silver tray. Additional invitations have arrived, Your Grace. Adrian accepted the letters with visible disinterest until his eyes narrowed slightly at the final envelope. Clara recognized the Whitmore seal immediately. From Edmund. Adrian broke the seal quickly and unfolded the letter in silence. As he read, his expression became dangerously unreadable. What happened? Clara asked quietly. Adrian handed her the letter without comment. Clara's pulse quickened instantly as she scanned the hurried handwriting. Clara, matters have escalated beyond my control. Several investors connected to the consortium have learned portions of the transfer records exist. Mother insists Ravenshire manipulated father before his death. Parliament rumors are spreading already. Return to Whitmore Hall immediately before this becomes irreversible. Clara lowered the paper slowly. Irreversible. Adrian moved toward the fireplace with measured calm. Meaning public. Clara stared at him. This is already public. No, his gray eyes lifted toward her steadily. At present society believes this is romantic scandal. Once Parliament realizes consortium influence changed hands secretly through inheritance structures, powerful men begin panicking. Cold settled through her chest again. How many people know? Too many. Adrian's voice sharpened slightly now. Someone leaked information from Whitmore Hall. Clara thought immediately of Lady Beatrice. Of course she would attempt controlling the narrative before truth destroyed her position completely. What happens now? Adrian was silent for several seconds before answering. Now they attempt to destroy your credibility before legal review begins. Clara went still. Legal review? The consortium board has demanded formal clarification regarding ownership transfers. And if they decide father acted improperly? Adrian's expression hardened. Then they attempt to invalidate every document connected to your inheritance. Fear finally pierced through exhaustion completely. Real fear this time. Not social embarrassment. Not whispered humiliation at ballroom edges. Actual danger. Can they do that? Adrian looked toward the snow outside briefly before answering. If they convince enough people you manipulated Lord Whitmore near the end of his life, yes. Clara felt suddenly sick. That is absurd. Of course it is. His gaze returned toward her. Absurdity has never prevented powerful men from protecting money. Silence settled heavily between them. Clara crossed slowly toward the fireplace, kneading warmth against the cold spreading through her hands. I should leave. Adrian's expression changed instantly. No. This situation worsens every hour I remain connected to you publicly. I do not care. You should. Her voice tightened despite herself. Your name already appears beside mine in every gossip column across London. Adrian stepped closer immediately. Clara. The sound of her name in his voice nearly undid her composure entirely. She looked away toward the fire. You promised my father protection. Fine. You fulfilled it. This is not obligation anymore. Silence crashed down instantly afterward. Adrian seemed to realize the mistake a fraction too late. Clara slowly lifted her eyes toward him. His expression remained controlled, though tension sharpened visibly along his jaw now. What exactly is it then? She asked softly. Another dangerous silence. Adrian Ashbourne rarely looked uncertain. Yet uncertainty flickered briefly across his face now before disappearing beneath restraint again. Complicated. Clara laughed once beneath her breath. That is an extraordinarily unfair answer from a man who demands honesty from everyone else. Before Adrian could reply, another knock interrupted sharply at the dining room door. A servant entered looking deeply uncomfortable. Your Grace. He hesitated visibly. Lord Ashcombe has arrived, along with 2 members of the consortium board. Adrian went completely still. Already? Yes, Your Grace. Clara's stomach tightened. What do they want? Adrian's expression hardened into pure control once more. To determine whether you are a frightened woman easily pressured into surrendering your inheritance. And if I am not? Then they attempt intimidation instead. The servant lingered awkwardly near the doorway. They requested privacy, Your Grace. Adrian's eyes cooled several degrees. They may request whatever pleases them. He turned toward Clara immediately afterward. You do not need to meet them today. Clara straightened slowly beside the fire. Fear still lingered inside her chest, but something stronger settled over it now. Anger perhaps, or exhaustion finally hardening into resolve. No, she said quietly. I think I do. 20 minutes later, Clara entered the formal receiving room at Ravenshire House beside Adrian, while 3 powerful men rose from velvet chairs near the hearth. Lord Ashcombe stood nearest the fireplace, silver-haired and visibly tense beneath impeccable tailoring. Beside him waited Mr. Hawthorne and Sir Lionel Graves, both senior consortium directors whose shipping interests stretched from London to New York. All 3 looked startled upon seeing Clara enter with Adrian rather than remaining hidden elsewhere in the house. Interesting. Your Grace, Ashcombe began carefully. Miss Whitmore. Clara inclined her head politely. Adrian remained beside her. Not touching. Never touching. Yet somehow more protective because of it. You requested clarification, he said calmly. Proceed. Sir Lionel cleared his throat. Rumors regarding inheritance transfers connected to Atlantic voting shares have created concern. Concern, Adrian repeated flatly. Naturally. Hawthorne stepped forward slightly. Miss Whitmore, perhaps you are unaware how unusual these arrangements appear. Clara met his gaze steadily. I am increasingly aware many men dislike unusual women. Silence. Ashcombe almost smiled before suppressing it quickly. Sir Lionel shifted uncomfortably. No offense is intended. Offense rarely announces itself beforehand, Adrian replied calmly. Hawthorne recovered first. Miss Whitmore, several board members worry Lord Whitmore acted under emotional distress before his death. There it was. Clara felt humiliation rise hot beneath her skin anyway despite expecting it. You believe I manipulated my dying father. We believe clarification is necessary. No, Clara said softly. You believe a woman inheriting influence makes men nervous. The room fell silent immediately. Adrian's gaze shifted toward her briefly. Not surprise. Something closer to admiration. Dangerous again. Lord Ashcombe finally sighed. Miss Whitmore, the issue is larger than appearances. No, she answered quietly. The issue is exactly appearances. If Edmund inherited these shares, no one would question his emotional influence over father. No one spoke because every man in the room understood she was correct. Hawthorne looked toward Adrian instead. Ravenshire, surely you recognize how damaging continued association appears. Adrian's expression became frighteningly calm. I recognize many things. Then perhaps some distance between yourself and Miss Whitmore would ease public speculation. Clara looked away instantly before emotion betrayed itself across her face. Of course, there it was. The practical solution. Separate from the scandalous woman before gossip damaged the Duke permanently too. Silence stretched through the receiving room. Then Adrian spoke with terrifying clarity. No, every person froze. Hawthorne blinked. I beg your pardon? Adrian's eyes remained ice-cold now. You suggested distance. I declined. Lord Ashcombe stared openly. Sir Lionel looked genuinely alarmed. Clara stopped breathing entirely. Adrian stepped slightly forward beside her. Miss Whitmore will attend the consortium hearing next week under my protection and with my full public support. Shock rippled visibly through the room. Hawthorne recovered first. Ravenshire, this could damage your standing politically. Then Parliament should improve its judgment. The silence afterward felt enormous. Clara looked toward him slowly while warmth and fear tangled painfully together inside her chest. Because Adrian Ashbourne had just chosen a side publicly. Completely. And everyone in the room understood exactly whose side it was. The hearing took place 3 days later beneath the vaulted ceilings of the Atlantic Trade Consortium headquarters overlooking the frozen Thames. Snow covered London in pale silver that morning, softening rooftops and carriage wheels alike beneath bitter December skies. Yet nothing about the atmosphere inside the consortium chamber felt soft. Clara sensed the hostility immediately upon entering beside Adrian. Dozens of men occupied the long semicircular rows surrounding the central hearing floor. Parliament investors, shipping directors, banking representatives, aristocrats whose fortunes depended upon Atlantic trade routes stretching from England to America. Conversations hushed the moment she appeared. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, a few barely concealed resentment. And nearly every eye in the room followed Adrian Ashbourne as he escorted Clara toward the front of the chamber with calm, unapologetic authority. They look as though I arrived carrying plague, Clara murmured quietly. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. No, his gaze swept across the crowded room once. They look frightened. Clara almost laughed despite the knot tightening painfully in her stomach. The consortium chamber resembled a cross between a courtroom and Parliament itself. Dark mahogany benches curved around a lowered central floor while enormous windows overlooked the snow-covered river beyond. At the far end of the chamber stood the elevated chairman's table, where 5 senior directors already waited beside stacks of ledgers and legal records. Lord Ashcombe occupied the center position. His silver hair appeared grayer than before. To his right sat Sir Lionel Graves and Mr. Hawthorne. To his left waited 2 additional directors Clara recognized only vaguely from prior London seasons. Every one of them looked exhausted. Good. Miss Whitmore. Lord Ashcombe rose slowly as she approached. Your Grace. Adrian inclined his head once. Proceed. Clara noticed several men visibly stiffen at the Duke's tone. Apparently even wealthy consortium directors disliked being reminded Ravenshire remained considerably more powerful than they were. Ashcombe gestured toward the chair positioned nearest the central table. Miss Whitmore, please sit. Clara did not move immediately. Am I being accused of something, Lord Ashcombe? Silence spread quickly through the chamber. Excellent. Let them say it aloud if they intended to. The older man removed his spectacles slowly. No formal accusation exists. Then why am I here? Hawthorne answered before anyone else could. Because uncertainty surrounding the transfer of consortium voting interests threatens market stability. Clara looked toward him calmly. Interesting phrasing. Meaning, you continue describing men's fear as financial concern. Several directors shifted uncomfortably. Adrian remained beside her silent and terrifyingly composed. Clara suspected he intentionally allowed her to answer alone now. Not abandoning her. Trusting her. Strange how much stronger that felt than rescue. Ashcombe finally sighed. Miss Whitmore, perhaps we should begin with the essential matter. Clara sat slowly while Adrian remained standing directly behind her chair. Again not touching. Never touching. Yet his presence settled behind her like armor anyway. Very well, she said quietly. Explain the essential matter. Ashcombe opened a leather portfolio carefully. 6 months before his death, Lord Whitmore transferred controlling voting shares connected to the Atlantic Consortium into your legal possession. Murmurs spread instantly through the chamber despite everyone already suspecting the truth. Clara kept her posture steady. Yes. Sir Lionel leaned forward sharply. Miss Whitmore, do you fully understand the scale of those holdings? I understand enough to recognize why everyone suddenly finds me interesting. Several men looked away immediately. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. These shares influence shipping routes, import taxation, banking agreements, and parliamentary negotiations on both sides of the Atlantic. Clara met his gaze steadily. Then perhaps Parliament should have noticed their existence before a woman inherited them. Silence crashed through the chamber. Somewhere behind her, Clara heard Adrian exhale softly through his nose. Amusement, perhaps. Dangerous timing for it. Ashcombe intervened quickly. No one disputes your intelligence, Miss Whitmore. That is generous considering half this room spent the week implying I manipulated my dying father. More silence. This time heavier. Because no one denied it. Clara felt anger steady her now where fear once lived. Good. Anger at least possessed direction. Hawthorne cleared his throat. Public concern arose because the transfers occurred secretly. Public concern arose because the transfers benefited me. Adrian finally spoke behind her. Accurate. Several directors visibly flinched at the interruption. Clara almost smiled. Ashcombe rubbed tired eyes briefly before continuing. There remains another issue. Clara's pulse quickened instantly. What issue? The chairman exchanged glances with the other directors before withdrawing one final document from the portfolio. We recently uncovered a sealed legal instrument attached to the original transfer records. Adrian went completely still behind her chair. Clara felt it immediately without needing to look. What kind of instrument? She asked carefully. Ashcombe unfolded the document slowly. A conditional inheritance declaration executed by Lord Whitmore and witnessed privately by Ravenshire himself. Clara turned sharply toward Adrian. He met her gaze evenly. You knew. Partially. You continue withholding astonishing amounts of information. Because your father requested timing. Frustration flashed through her before Ashcombe interrupted. Miss Whitmore. Clara turned back toward the chairman. Read it. The older man adjusted his spectacles carefully. In the event of my death, all controlling voting interests associated with the Atlantic Consortium shall remain under the sole authority of my daughter Clara Whitmore. Said authority may not be transferred through marriage, coercion, or external parliamentary pressure without her direct consent. Murmurs erupted instantly across the chamber. Clara barely heard them, her attention fixed entirely on one phrase. Without marriage? Ashcombe nodded grimly. Your father specifically prevented any future husband from automatically controlling the consortium through marital law. Shock moved coldly through her chest. Her father had anticipated everything. Every legal loophole. Every aristocratic expectation reducing women's wealth to male ownership after marriage. Adrian spoke quietly behind her. Lord Whitmore understood precisely how vulnerable inherited female assets become under English law. Clara looked up at him slowly. That is why he hid everything. Adrian nodded once. Yes. Hawthorne leaned forward sharply now. Miss Whitmore, you must understand what this means politically. I understand what it means personally, she replied softly. My father spent his final months ensuring no man could take this from me. Silence spread again. Real silence this time. Not hostile. Reflective. Several older directors exchanged uneasy looks. Perhaps for the first time, they recognized the situation not as scandal but strategy. Lord Whitmore had not acted irrationally before death. He had acted brilliantly. Then the chamber doors opened violently enough to echo across the vaulted room. Every head turned immediately. Lady Beatrice entered first wrapped in severe black velvet. Edmund close behind her looking pale and exhausted. Lydia followed silently several steps back. Clara's stomach tightened instantly. Adrian's expression hardened beside her. This hearing is private, Hawthorne snapped. Lady Beatrice ignored him entirely. Her eyes locked directly onto Clara. No, she said coldly. This hearing concerns my family. Ashcombe rose sharply. Lady Beatrice, you were not summoned. Because certain people hoped truth would remain selective. She stepped forward into the center aisle while whispers spread rapidly through the chamber. Clara watched Lydia carefully now. Her younger sister looked terrified. Edmund looked worse. Defeated, perhaps. Lady Beatrice finally stopped directly before the central hearing floor. You all wish to know why Lord Whitmore hid those shares? Her voice carried clearly through the chamber. Fine. Then let us discuss the entire truth. Adrian moved slightly closer toward Clara immediately. Protective instinct again. Careful, he said quietly. Lady Beatrice laughed softly without humor. You think I fear this room anymore? Her eyes shifted toward Clara once more. Your father did not leave you money because money was never the inheritance. Clara felt cold dread spread through her chest. What are you talking about? Lady Beatrice lifted her chin. The Atlantic Consortium itself was built partially from your grandmother's American trade holdings after the war. Murmurs spread instantly. Hawthorne went pale. Ashcombe looked horrified. Adrian's jaw tightened visibly. Meaning? Clara whispered. Lady Beatrice's eyes glittered sharply now. Meaning the Whitmore family does not merely own consortium shares. She pointed directly toward Clara. You are the legal majority heir to the original Atlantic Charter itself. Silence. Total and absolute. Clara stopped breathing entirely. Around the chamber, men stared openly in shock. One director actually lowered himself into a chair as though his legs failed beneath him. Ashcombe looked nearly ill. That cannot be correct, Hawthorne whispered. Lady Beatrice laughed again. Oh, but it is. She reached into her reticule and withdrew several folded documents. Your father concealed the original charter inheritance through layered trusts for decades. He intended Clara to inherit complete controlling authority once legal protections were secure. Clara's pulse thundered violently now. No, Adrian took the documents from Lady Beatrice with frightening calm and scanned them rapidly. For the first time since she had met him, genuine shock crossed his face openly. Dear God, Ashcombe whispered. Adrian slowly lifted his eyes toward Clara. It is authentic. The room exploded into overlapping voices immediately afterward. Parliament investors shouting questions. Directors arguing. Men demanding records and legal review. Through all the chaos, Clara heard only one thing clearly. She had never inherited nothing. She had inherited everything. And suddenly every person who once pitied her looked terrified instead. 3 weeks later, London society behaved as though it had never mocked Clara Whitmore at all. That, more than anything else, taught her how quickly power altered memory. Invitations arrived daily at Ravenshire House now. Handwritten apologies from women who once whispered behind fans. Business requests from men who previously questioned her intelligence. Marriage proposals from titled strangers who suddenly discovered admiration for independent women with political influence. Clara ignored nearly all of it. Snow still covered London beneath silver winter skies, though Christmas decorations now glowed warmly along carriage-lined streets and ballroom entrances throughout Mayfair. The season continued exactly as it always had. Only now, every drawing-room conversation in England seemed to revolve around one woman. The consortium confirmed the inheritance publicly this morning, Lydia said quietly one afternoon while standing beside Clara near the library windows at Whitmore Hall. It was the first time the sisters had been alone together in days. Clara looked out across the frozen gardens without answering immediately. "I know. People are calling you the most powerful unmarried woman in London." Clara almost smiled at that. How unfortunate for London. Lydia laughed softly beneath her breath before silence settled between them again. Different silence now. Less cruel. More uncertain. "I was awful to you," Lydia admitted quietly at last. Clara looked toward her sister slowly. Genuine regret lingered across Lydia's face. Not social regret. Real regret. "Yes," Clara answered honestly. Lydia lowered her eyes. "I thought Father loved you more." Pain flickered briefly through Clara's chest. "He loved us differently. That does not always feel fair." "No," Clara stepped closer slowly. "But fear made all of us unkind eventually." Lydia swallowed hard before nodding once. Across the corridor outside, voices echoed faintly through Whitmore Hall where lawyers, accountants, and consortium representatives now moved constantly between rooms reviewing decades of hidden financial structures. Lady Beatrice remained largely confined to private quarters these days after formally admitting to manipulating portions of the estate accounts under pressure from mounting debts and political fear. Edmund spent most of his time attempting unsuccessfully to repair damaged business relationships throughout London. Nothing would ever fully return to what it had been before. Perhaps that was not entirely tragic. "Do you hate us?" Lydia asked suddenly. Clara considered the question carefully. "No," she said softly. "But I think I finally understand all of you clearly now." Lydia looked relieved and devastated simultaneously. "That sounds worse somehow. Perhaps honesty usually does." A servant appeared moments later in the doorway. "Miss Whitmore, His Grace has arrived." Warmth moved unexpectedly through Clara's chest before she could stop it. Ridiculous that his arrival still affected her this way after everything that had happened. Lydia noticed immediately, of course. Younger sisters always noticed such things. "Interesting," she murmured beneath her breath. Clara ignored her entirely and crossed toward the front staircase before additional commentary could follow. Adrian waited in the entrance hall beside the great marble staircase, still dressed in dark winter riding clothes dusted lightly with snow. Even now servants moved differently around him. Straighter, faster, as though the Duke of Ravenshire altered gravity itself merely by entering rooms. He looked up the instant Clara descended the stairs. That familiar sensation returned immediately. Not being admired, being seen. "You came personally," Clara observed once she reached the final step. Adrian removed his gloves slowly. "I often do." Dangerous answer. Clara ignored the warmth threatening her composure again. "To what do I owe the honor today?" "Lady Ashcombe's winter masquerade this evening." Clara blinked. "I had forgotten." "London has not." Adrian extended a folded invitation card toward her. Gold lettering shimmered softly against dark blue parchment. Lady Clarissa Ashcombe requests the honor of Miss Clara Whitmore's presence at the winter masquerade celebrating the new Atlantic Charter Agreement. Clara stared at the words carefully. Weeks earlier she had entered Ashcombe's ballroom as the Woman's Society pitted. Tonight she would enter as the Woman's Society feared disappointing. Strange how quickly fortunes turned. I am not certain I wish to attend another ballroom filled with people pretending they always respected me. Adrian's gray eyes remained fixed steadily on hers. Then attend for yourself instead. Clara looked away briefly toward the snowfall beyond the entrance doors. You make difficult things sound simple. No, his voice lowered slightly. I merely think you deserve to walk into rooms without shame. Her heartbeat betrayed her again. Hopelessly. Several hours later, Clara stood at the top of the grand staircase inside Lady Ashcombe's glittering ballroom while an entire room fell silent beneath her arrival. Not gradually silent. Instantly silent. Hundreds of guests filled the enormous hall beneath crystal chandeliers and winter garlands woven through marble columns. Music stopped midway through a violin phrase as every face turned upward toward the staircase. Clara felt the reaction physically. Shock, awe, calculation, respect, fear. The same people who once whispered about her empty inheritance now stared as though royalty itself had entered the room. She wore deep midnight blue silk tonight threaded with silver embroidery that caught candlelight like falling stars. No excessive diamonds. No dramatic display of wealth. She no longer needed proof of importance stitched visibly into gowns. The room already knew exactly who she was. Adrian stood beside her in black evening attire severe enough to make half the ballroom look decorative by comparison. Together they descended the staircase slowly beneath complete silence. Clara noticed Lady Pembroke near the orchestra nearly dropping her champagne glass entirely. Lord Pembroke looked moments from choking. Several young women who once avoided her eyes now watched openly with envy. Fascinating how quickly pity transformed into admiration once wealth entered the conversation. The room appears unusually quiet, Clara murmured softly as they crossed the ballroom floor. Adrian glanced toward the stunned crowd surrounding them. Perhaps everyone suddenly developed intelligence. Clara nearly laughed. Across the ballroom, consortium directors bowed respectfully as she passed. Parliament ministers inclined their heads. Wealthy investors who once questioned her legitimacy now looked eager for conversation. Clara understood the game now. Power did not change society. It merely revealed what society had always valued most. Yet strangely, none of it satisfied her as much as she once imagined public approval might. Because while the ballroom stared at her fortune, Adrian still looked at her exactly the same way he had before anyone knew the truth. Steady. Intentional. Real. Lady Ashcombe herself hurried forward through the crowd moments later glowing with social excitement. Miss Whitmore. She clasped Clara's hands warmly. London has spoken of nothing except your extraordinary inheritance for days. Clara smiled politely. London requires more fulfilling hobbies. The older woman laughed brightly while nearby guests listened with obvious fascination. You are magnificent. No, Clara replied softly. Merely tired. Adrian's mouth almost curved beside her. He understood precisely what she meant. Hours passed beneath music, dancing, and endless political conversation. Clara moved through the ballroom with increasing calm while aristocrats who once dismissed her now competed desperately for her attention. Yet gradually she found herself drifting more often toward Adrian's side between dances and conversations alike. Familiarity had become comfort somehow. Dangerous evolution. Near midnight, the orchestra began a final waltz beneath glittering candlelight and softly falling snow visible through the ballroom windows. Couples moved gracefully onto the marble floor while servants dimmed several chandeliers, bathing the enormous room in warm gold. Adrian approached her quietly near one of the winter rose arrangements lining the ballroom edge. Dance with me. Not a question. Clara looked up at him steadily. You dislike dancing. Frequently. Then why ask? His gaze held hers without wavering. Because some moments should not be surrendered to fear simply because they matter. Her breath caught softly. Dangerous man. Very dangerous man. Clara placed her hand into his. The ballroom reacted instantly as they stepped onto the dance floor together. Whispers spread again. Heads turned. Yet this silence felt different from earlier ones. Not shock this time. Anticipation. Adrian drew her gently into the first movements of the waltz beneath the swell of violins and candlelight. He danced exactly as he lived. Controlled. Precise. Entirely impossible to ignore. "Everyone is staring," Clara murmured quietly. "Let them. You truly enjoy intimidating London. Only when London deserves it." She laughed softly despite herself while they moved through elegant turns across polished marble. Snow drifted endlessly beyond towering windows now, turning the world outside silver and distant. "You realize society will discuss this for months," she said. Adrian looked down at her steadily. "Good." The simple certainty in his voice unsettled her pulse again. Clara swallowed carefully. Adrian. It was the first time she had used his given name aloud. The effect was immediate. Something changed in his expression. Softer. More dangerous than coldness ever was. "Clara," he answered quietly. The music seemed to disappear around them after that. Or perhaps the rest of the ballroom simply stopped matching. Adrian guided her through another slow turn before speaking again. "Do you remember what your cousin said the day your father's will was read?" Clara blinked in surprise. "About the key?" "Yes." Warmth flickered across his eyes now beneath candlelight. "He said perhaps you could sell it for bread." Clara laughed softly. "I remember." Adrian slowed slightly at the center of the ballroom while hundreds of guests watched openly around them. "Everything they tried to take from you," he said quietly, "was already yours." Emotion tightened unexpectedly in Clara's chest. Because suddenly she understood he was not speaking only about wealth. They had tried to take her confidence, her dignity, her voice, her future. Yet somehow she still stood here beneath crystal chandeliers with the most powerful man in England looking at her as though none of those cruel whispers had ever defined her at all. The music softened toward its ending. Adrian stopped dancing entirely then. Right there at the center of the ballroom. The room quieted instantly around them. Confused murmurs spread through the watching crowd as the Duke of Ravenshire released Clara's hand slowly before doing something no one in England had ever seen him do publicly. He knelt. Complete silence crashed through the ballroom. Lady Pembroke gasped audibly near the orchestra. Someone dropped a champagne glass somewhere near the back wall. Adrian looked up at Clara with calm certainty despite the stunned aristocracy surrounding them. "I spent most of my life believing loyalty mattered more than love," he said quietly. "Then I met a woman who survived humiliation with more grace than most people survive admiration." Clara felt tears burn instantly behind her eyes. The ballroom had disappeared entirely now. Only him. Only this moment. Adrian reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet ring box before continuing softly. "Your father trusted me to protect you. Somewhere along the way, protecting you became the least important reason I wanted to remain beside you." Clara could barely breathe. Around them, London society remained frozen in absolute disbelief. The feared Duke of Ravenshire, kneeling publicly before the woman everyone once pitied. "Marry me, Clara." His voice never shook. "Not because of what you inherited. Not because Parliament fears you. Not because society finally learned your value." His gray eyes held hers steadily. "Marry me because when the entire world underestimated you, I never could." Tears slipped down Clara's cheeks before she could stop them. Real tears this time. Not humiliation. Relief. Love. Vindication. Every cruel whisper. Every mocking smile. Every moment she spent believing herself unwanted seemed to collapse quietly behind her all at once. She smiled through tears anyway. "Yes," she whispered. Adrian's expression changed then in a way Clara knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Not cold. Not guarded. Happy. Truly happy. The ballroom erupted seconds later into stunned applause and astonished conversation while Adrian rose slowly to his feet before sliding the ring carefully onto her trembling hand. Somewhere near the orchestra, Lady Pembroke appeared close to fainting entirely. Clara almost laughed through her tears. Adrian drew her gently closer beneath the golden ballroom light while snow continued falling softly beyond the windows of London. And for the first time since her father died, Clara Whitmore no longer felt like a woman waiting for life to choose her. Because at last, before all of society, she had finally been chosen first.